There are 12 things the god called Enki is said to have written down before the family silenced him. Not 12 stories, not 12 prayers, 12 statements. Each one begins the same way in the surviving fragments. Each one begins with the phrase, "This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written." 12 of them, numbered, in order. And the 12th one, the last one, the one that ends the sequence, is the reason his name was struck from the ceremonial tablets of his own city, and the reason the priesthood that inherited his knowledge spent the next 3,000 years splitting his testimony into pieces, hiding each piece inside a different myth, and pretending that the 12 statements had never existed as a single document. They existed. They were kept. And most of them are still readable, if you know which cylinder to pull from which shelf, which fragment to lift from which broken tablet, which line in which ritual text was copied by a scribe who did not understand what he was copying. Enki was the god of the fresh water, the god of wisdom, the god who is said to have loved the human beings his own family created for labor and then decided to destroy. He was called the friend of humans. He was called the traitor by his brother. He was called the one who talks too much by his father. And when the 12th thing was recorded, when the last statement was set down in the clay, he was called something else. He was called finished. The word used in the earliest fragments is not silenced in the modern sense. It is not that he was killed. It is that his testimony was ordered removed from all future tablets. His speaking role in the great councils was ended. His temple continued to function. His name continued to appear in offering lists. But his voice, his direct voice, his first-person testimony was cut. Everything written about him after that moment is written by other scribes, other priesthoods, other hands. The God who spoke to humans was ordered to stop speaking. And the 12 things he had already said, the 12 things that could not be unsaid, became the most carefully hidden document in the ancient world. You are going to hear all 12 tonight, in order, as they were numbered, not as the priesthood later rearranged them, not as the modern translators softened them. As they were spoken, you are going to hear what Enki said about who the gods really are, where they came from, what they built humans to do, what they did to the planet before humans were made, what they did to it after, and what they plan to do when they return. You are going to hear the reason his brother voted for the flood. You are going to hear the reason Enki warned one man. You are going to hear the argument that took place in the council chamber the night the flood was approved, and the argument that took place the morning after, when the family realized what Enki had done. And you are going to hear the 12th thing, the last statement, the one that ended his voice. That statement is not about the flood. It is not about the creation of humans. It is not about the war between his brother and his son. It is about something else. Something the family had agreed, in the earliest days, would never be written down. Something they had sworn between themselves to keep hidden, not from humans, not from the servants, but from each other. Enki wrote it anyway. He wrote it in the 12th place, at the end of the sequence, in the exact position where a scribe would look for the final summary. He wrote it as the last word, and when the family read it, they did not argue with him. They did not challenge him. They did not accuse him. They simply stopped his voice. That is the sequence you are about to hear. 12 statements, in order, beginning with the one that describes who the gods actually are, and ending with the one that reveals what the gods did not want each other to know. Sit down. Do not skip ahead. The 12th only makes sense if you have heard the first 11, in the order they were spoken, because Enki himself said, in the opening line of the first tablet, that the sequence was chosen deliberately, and that anyone who reads them out of order will misunderstand what he is trying to say. We are going to read them in order. Beginning now, the first thing Enki said, "This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. The gods are not one being. The gods are not many beings. The gods are a family, and the family is at war with itself." He said this first because everything else that follows depends on it. If you do not understand that the beings the ancient world called gods were a family, and that the family had a father, and that the father had two sons who did not agree, and that the two sons had children who took sides, and that the children had grandchildren who inherited the sides they were born into, then you will read every ancient text as if it were about worship. It is not about worship. It is about a succession dispute. It is about who inherits, who commands, who owns the planet, who owns the humans on it, and who has the right to decide what happens next. Every myth, Enki said, every hymn, every ritual, every prayer that survived from the old world is a piece of that dispute. Read them that way. Read them as court records from a family fight. He named the father first. The father was called An in the oldest fragments. and Anu in the later ones. And the name means simply the high one, the one above. He was not the first. He had a father before him, and that father had a father before him, and the line extended back into a time and a place that Enki himself said he did not fully understand. But An was the one who arrived here. An was the one who made the decisions about this planet. An was the head of the household when the family came. And An was the one whose word settled every argument until the argument grew too large for even him to settle. And that argument, Enki said, was about his two sons. The two sons were not born on this planet. They were born before the family arrived, and they were not born to the same mother. That fact, Enki said, is where the war begins. The elder son was called Enlil. The name means Lord of the Air, Lord of the Command, Lord of the Breath that carries orders. He was the son of An by An's official wife, the woman the family recognized as the mother of the air. He was the legitimate son. He was the son who, by the laws of the family, was supposed to inherit everything, and owned, including the planet, including the humans, including the right to decide what would be built here and what would be destroyed here. Enlil was raised to inherit. Enlil was raised to command. And Enlil knew, from the day he was old enough to understand what inheritance meant, that everything untouched would one day belong to him. The younger son was called Enki. And this is where the trouble starts. Enki was not the son of An's official wife. Enki was the son of An by another woman, a woman whose name the later scribes tried very hard to erase, but whose name appears in the oldest fragments as Namu. Namu was called the mother of the deep, the woman of the first water, the one who came from before. She was, in the earliest telling, older than An himself. She was not a wife in the political sense. She was something else, something the family did not have a word for. And when she bore An a son, the family faced a problem it had never faced before. The son was older than the official heir. The son was older, and by the oldest tradition of all, the firstborn inherits. But the firstborn was not the legitimate son. The firstborn was the son of the wrong mother. And so a decision was made in the family council that governed the family long before the family ever came to this planet, that the older tradition would be overridden. That the newer tradition, the political tradition, the tradition that said the son of the recognized wife inherits, regardless of birth order, would be applied. Enlil was named the heir. Enki was named something else. Enki was given a title that acknowledged his birth but denied him the inheritance. He was called the Wise One. He was called the Crafty One. He was called the one who knows the water and the deep and the things beneath. He was given the sciences. He was given the crafts. He was given the fresh water of the planet when the family arrived here. Because water is life, and giving him water was a way of acknowledging that he was, biologically, the elder. But he was not given the command. The command went to Enlil. And Enki said in the first statement, never forgot the decision. He did not rebel. That is important. Enki never took up arms against his father or his brother. Enki accepted the ruling, but he accepted it the way a man accepts a bad verdict from a court he cannot appeal. He accepted it in body. He did not accept it in spirit. And everything Enki did afterward, every decision he made, every project he took on, every experiment he ran, every argument he made in the council, was shaped by the fact that he believed, and had reason to believe, that the inheritance had been given to the wrong brother. The family arrived on this planet, Enki said, because they needed something. He was careful, in the first statement, not to say exactly what they needed. He said the family had a need. He said the need was material. He said the need required the family to travel a long distance, further than any of them had traveled before, and to set up an operation that would supply the need over a long period of time. He said the planet was chosen because it had what the family needed in large quantities, and because it was, at the time of arrival, unoccupied by any intelligent life that could contest the claim. There were animals here. There were plants. There was climate and weather and geography. But there was nothing that could say no to the family taking what it wanted. And so the family took it. An divided the planet. He gave the sky and the command to Enlil. He gave the fresh water and the crafts to Enki. He gave the underworld, the deep places, the metals beneath the ground, to a third figure whose role Enki mentioned only briefly in the first statement, and whose full identity would be developed in later statements. He kept the overall authority for himself, but he did not live on the planet full time. He came and went. He returned to the family's original seat, wherever that was, and he came back to the planet only when major decisions had to be made. In his absence, the day-to-day command belonged to Enlil. and Enki, the elder by birth, worked under his younger brother's authority for as long as the family remained here. That situation, Enki said, was untenable from the beginning. It was a peace held together only by Anne's ruling and Anne's occasional visits. When Anne was here, everyone behaved. When Anne was gone, the tension surfaced. Enlil issued orders. Enki obeyed some and quietly ignored others. The staff, the workers, the servants who had come with the family from wherever they had come from, took sides. Some served Enlil loyally. Some served Enki loyally. Some tried to serve both and were destroyed by the attempt. And this was before humans existed. This was before the creation. This was the internal condition of the family on the day they decided to create the first human being. And Enki said, in the first statement, that if you do not understand the condition of the family at that moment, you will not understand why humans were made the way they were made, why they were given the traits they were given, why some of them were favored and some were used, and why the first great decision the family ever made together, the decision to end the human experiment in a flood, was made along the fault line that already existed between the two brothers. Enki said the family had 4 fundamental disagreements at the moment humans were created. He listed them. He listed them in the order he considered most important, and he said any human reading his testimony should remember all 4, because every event that follows in the human story maps onto one or more of these 4 disagreements. The first disagreement was about whether humans should be made at all. Enki was for, Enlil was against. The vote in the council was close, and it was Anne who broke the tie in favor of creation, because the family's labor problem, the problem of not having enough hands to do the work the family had come here to do, was becoming urgent. Enlil accepted the ruling but never accepted the creatures. He viewed humans, from the moment of their creation, as a labor solution imposed on him against his better judgment. He viewed them as expendable. He viewed them as replaceable. And when the population grew large and became noisy, he viewed them as a problem to be solved. The second disagreement was about how much humans should be given. Enki wanted to give them speech. Enlil wanted them silent. Enki wanted to give them tools. Enlil wanted them to work with their hands only. Enki wanted to teach them the crafts. Enlil wanted them ignorant. On every question of what humans should know and what humans should be able to do, the two brothers took opposite positions, and the compromise, which was never really a compromise, was that Enki got most of what he wanted because he was the one who actually did the crafts. And Enki, in the execution, built into humans more capacity than his brother had authorized. He gave them language. He gave them curiosity. He gave them the ability to organize into groups and cities and civilizations. He gave them, in his own words from the first statement, more than they were supposed to have. And he did this because he believed, and had believed since the moment of the inheritance ruling, that his own judgment was better than his brother's, and that a species with more capacity would be more useful to the family in the long run than a species with less. The third disagreement was about what should happen to humans when the family left. Enki assumed the family would eventually leave. The operation the family had come here to run would eventually be completed, and the family would return to wherever they had come from, and the humans would be left behind. Enlil agreed with this in principle, but disagreed with what should happen at the moment of departure. Enki wanted the humans preserved. He wanted them given the knowledge that would allow them to continue after the family was gone. He wanted, in essence, to bequeath the planet to the species he had made. Enlil wanted the humans erased. He wanted the operation shut down cleanly, with no witnesses, no inheritors, no traces. He wanted the planet returned to the condition it had been in when the family arrived. This disagreement, Enki said, was the one that would eventually produce the flood. Enlil never got to shut down the operation cleanly. He tried, once, with the flood. Enki interfered. And ever since, Enlil has held a grudge that the first statement, Enki said, has never fully described, because the full description would take more space than a first statement allows. The fourth disagreement was about the succession. This was the oldest disagreement, the disagreement from before any of the others, and it colored all 3 of the others. Enlil believed that as Anne's chosen heir, he had final authority over every project on the planet, including the human project. Enki believed that as the biological firstborn, he had a moral authority that predated the ruling, and that in matters concerning the humans he had personally created, his authority should be equal to or greater than his brother's. The 2 of them argued this point in every council meeting for as long as the councils continued to meet, and never fully settled it, because Anne, Enki said, secretly agreed with parts of both positions. Anne had made the ruling in favor of Enlil because the family required stability, not because he believed Enlil was the better choice. And Anne Enki said, sometimes signaled his real preferences by allowing Enki to win small victories in council, by allowing Enki's projects to proceed even when Enlil objected, by allowing Enki to speak first in ceremonial matters even when protocol said Enlil should speak first. These signals were small, and they were never made openly, but they were noticed by the family. And they added, Enki said, a fifth layer of tension to the 4 disagreements he had just listed, because they meant that the succession itself was never entirely stable, and every member of the family knew, in the back of their mind, that the ruling could someday be reversed. That, Enki said, is the family. That is the condition of the household on the day the first human being drew breath. 2 brothers, each convinced the other should not be in charge. A father who ruled in favor of the younger but favored the elder in private. A pantheon of children and grandchildren already choosing sides, already forming factions, already positioning themselves for a future succession fight that everyone knew was coming and no one dared to acknowledge openly. This is not, Enki said, the way the priests will later describe the gods. The priests will describe the gods as unified. The priests will describe the pantheon as ordered, with clear ranks and clear titles and clear responsibilities. The priests will describe the family as if it were an army, with An at the top and everyone else obeying in perfect sequence. That description, Enki said, is false. It is the description the family wants humans to believe, because a unified pantheon is easier to worship than a divided one. But it is not the truth. The truth is what he is telling you now. The family is at war with itself. It has been at war with itself since before the planet was chosen. And every event in human history, every rise of a civilization, every fall of a civilization, every flood, every plague, every dark age, every golden age, has been shaped by which side of the family had the upper hand at the moment. He ended the first statement with a warning. He said, if you read only this first statement and go no further, you will misunderstand everything I am about to tell you. You will think the war between my brother and me is the whole story. It is not the whole story. It is the frame. The full picture requires all 12. The full picture requires you to see how the war between me and my brother produced the flood, produced the tower, produced the scattering of languages, produced the empires, produced the priesthoods that have hidden my testimony from you for 3,000 years. But you cannot see the full picture until you have read all 12 statements in order. Read them in order. Do not skip. Do not rearrange. The order is the argument. The order is the point. Read the first, then the second, then the third, in the order I have set them down, and by the 12th you will understand why the family stopped my voice. Before we go to the second statement, there is one more thing that has to be said about the first, because the priests who inherited Enki's testimony deliberately misplaced it. In the version of the first statement that survives most completely, the version that was copied by the scribe who worked in the temple at Eridu during the second dynasty of that city, there is a closing line that appears in no later copy. The line reads, "And I have said this to my sons as well, and my sons have said it to their sons, so that the memory of the family fight will not be lost when the humans forget the gods." This line was removed, in every subsequent copy, by scribes who did not want humans to know that Enki had passed the testimony down through his own bloodline. Because if Enki passed it down through his own bloodline, then somewhere on this planet, right now, there are human beings who carry the knowledge of the family fight in their inheritance, whether they know it consciously or not. That is a claim the priesthood did not want in circulation. That is a claim that would give certain human lineages a status the priesthood was not prepared to grant. And so the line was removed, and the removal was so thorough that only one copy, one broken cylinder from one obscure temple, preserves it. Enki said it. The family knew he said it, and the reason he said it, he explained in the second statement, was that he intended, from the very beginning, for the 12 testimonies to survive not as public documents, but as private inheritances, carried by specific human lines, revealed only when the time was right, and interpreted only by those who had been prepared, through generations of teaching, to understand what he was actually saying. The first statement, then, is not just a description of the family. It is also a declaration of intent. It is Enki saying publicly that he has taken sides. He has taken the human side. He has invested his testimony in the humans he made, rather than in the family that made him. And this act, this declaration, this alignment, is what would eventually cost him his voice. Quick pause. This is new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there is a second document. It is called the 7 Resets. Every time this planet was erased, matched against the 12 statements you are hearing, and the checklist of signs for the 8th, 4 are already active. Linked below, QR on screen. Back to the video. The second thing Enki said, "This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. Humans were not made because the gods loved you. Humans were made because the gods needed labor, and the labor problem had become severe enough that even my brother, who did not want you made, could not vote against the proposal. He was blunt about it, in the second statement, in a way that the later priests found deeply uncomfortable. The priests preferred the story in which humans were the crown of creation, the beloved children of the divine, the beings for whom the world had been prepared as a gift. Enki said, "No, that story is a fiction. It is a fiction the priests invented later because it made humans easier to manage. If you tell a species it was made in love, it will accept nearly anything from the beings who claim to love it. If you tell it was made for work, it will start to ask questions." And so the priest told the love story. And Enki, in the second statement, told the other one. The work, he said, was mining. Specifically, the work was the extraction of a particular metal from the crust of this planet, a metal the family needed in large quantities for a purpose. Enki, again, did not fully describe in the second statement, but which he said involved the atmosphere of the family's homeworld. The homeworld's atmosphere was failing. Something was going wrong with the layer that surrounded the homeworld and protected it from the radiation of its own star. The family had determined, through means Enki did not describe, that a particular metal, in fine particulate form, dispersed at high altitude, could stabilize the failing layer and buy the homeworld several thousand more years of habitability. The metal existed on the homeworld only in traces. It existed on this planet in enormous quantities, deposited in specific geological regions by processes that had taken place long before the family arrived. This planet, in other words, was chosen not because it was beautiful, and not because it had life on it, and not because the family had any interest in it beyond its utility, but because it had the metal, and the metal was needed, and the family had run out of easier options. The family began the mining operation with its own personnel. The workers who had come with the family from the homeworld were assigned to the mines. They were the family's own kind, lower in rank than the ruling members, but still members of the same species, still capable of speech and reason and complex work. They were called, in the earliest fragments, the Igigi. The name means, in the oldest reading, the ones who watch, or the ones who go around. And it refers to the fact that many of them worked in orbit as well as on the surface, moving between the ground operations and the transport ships that would carry the extracted metal back to the homeworld. The Igigi worked the mines for a period. Enki did not specify precisely, but which he said was long. Longer than any human civilization has ever lasted. Longer than most human beings can conceive of. They worked, and they worked, and they worked, and eventually, they revolted. The revolt of the Igigi is the event that immediately preceded the creation of humans, and Enki said, in the second statement, that anyone who wants to understand why humans exist must understand what happened in that revolt. The Igigi did not revolt because they were mistreated in the sense a human would recognize. They were fed, they were housed, they were not beaten or tortured. But they had been promised, when they came to this planet, that their work would be temporary, that they would be rotated back to the homeworld after a set period, that new personnel would be brought in to replace them. None of that happened. The rotations were postponed and then canceled. The replacements were never sent. The Igigi worked for what to them felt like forever, and then longer than forever, and eventually they came to understand that they had been abandoned, that the family had no intention of ever relieving them, that they had been sent here to work, and they would be worked, and they would die here, and their children, if they were permitted to have children, would work in their place. When that understanding became general among them, they laid down their tools. They walked out of the mines. They gathered on a mountain that Enki named in the second statement, but whose modern location has been the subject of dispute for 2 centuries. They gathered there, and they burned their work implements in a fire, and they sent word to the family council that they would work no more. The family panicked. The metal had to be extracted. The home world was depending on the shipments. If the shipments stopped, the failing atmosphere would fail faster, and the family's own kind, back on the home world, would begin to die. But the workers had refused, and the family could not force them, because the Igigi outnumbered the ruling members many times over, and any attempt to compel them by force would have produced a war the family could not afford. The family did what families do in such moments. It called an emergency council. It debated. It argued. It considered every alternative. And in the end, it accepted a proposal that Enki himself put forward in the last hour of the last day of the debate, when every other option had been rejected. His proposal was this: make a new worker. Not from the family's own kind, from the material that was available here on the planet. There were primates on this planet, primates that walked upright, primates that used simple tools, primates that had, in his assessment, enough biological capacity to be modified into a workforce. Take the primates, modify them, add to them what they lacked, the genetic material that would give them the capacity for language and organized labor and following instructions. Subtract from them what would be inconvenient, the traits that made them wild and independent and unlikely to accept command. Make them, in short, a hybrid. Part what they already were, part what the family was. A new species, made for the purpose. A species that would be born already understanding that its function was to work, that would accept the minds as its natural condition, that would reproduce on its own without requiring the family to import new personnel from the home world, and that would relieve the Igigi so that the Igigi could return to the roles they had been promised. The proposal was radical. It was radical because the family had never done anything like it before. The family had traveled. The family had mined. The family had operated on many planets over many generations. But the family had never, on any of those planets, taken a native species and modified it into a workforce. There were rules, in the family's own tradition, against doing exactly what Enki was proposing. The rules had been laid down by An's own father, or perhaps his grandfather, in a period Enki did not specify, and the rules had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of moral and legal complication that the creation of a hybrid species would produce. If you make a new species, the rules said, you become responsible for it. If you make it in your own image, you owe it what you owe your own kind. If you make it capable of speech, it can speak back to you. If you make it capable of reason, it can question you. If you make it capable of reproduction, you have created a lineage that will outlast your own operations, and you will be answerable in the family's records for whatever happens to that lineage after you leave. Enki knew all of that when he made the proposal. He said, in the second statement, that he made the proposal knowing full well the rules he was proposing to break. He said he made it because there was no other way to solve the labor problem in the time available, and because he had already begun, in his own private studies, to consider what kind of species could be built from the primate material that was available. He had, in effect, done the design work in advance. He had a plan. He had, in the second statement, done more than plan. He had done small trial experiments in his private laboratory at Eridu, using primate material acquired in ways he did not describe, to determine what modifications would be necessary and whether they would produce a viable creature. The trials had been promising. The plan was ready. And when the family, in desperation, accepted the proposal, Enki was ready to execute it immediately. The execution required a partner. The genetic modifications Enki was proposing required not only technical work but also a source material component that only the female members of the family could provide. Specifically, the process required the participation of a female of the ruling class, someone whose biology carried the traits that would be added to the primate template. Enki went to his half-sister. Her name was Ninhursag, and she was called the Lady of the Mountain, and she was, among other things, the family's chief medical officer, the one who oversaw the health of the personnel and the design of any biological modification the family undertook. Ninhursag was not aligned with either brother. She had, throughout her life, kept a careful neutrality between Enki and Enlil, and she had done so precisely because she knew that the family's future depended on someone remaining in the middle when the two brothers fought. When Enki brought her the proposal, she listened. She reviewed the technical plan. She agreed, after considerable discussion, that the plan would work. And she agreed to participate, on one condition. The condition was that the new species, once created, would be treated with dignity, that it would not be a slave in the sense the older species had been slaves, that it would be given, along with its function, the basic protections that any thinking being deserved. Enki agreed. He agreed publicly, before the council, and the agreement was recorded in the family's own tablets. And then the work began. The creation, Enki said, took longer than most human myths describe. The myths describe a moment, a word spoken, a hand raised, a single act of divine command. The reality was slow. It was iterative. The first prototypes failed. The second prototypes were partial successes. The third prototypes lived but did not reproduce. The fourth prototypes reproduced but produced offspring that were unstable. Only in the seventh or eighth generation of design, Enki said, did the family produce a hybrid that lived, worked, reproduced, and remained stable across generations. That hybrid was the first human being, or rather, the first pair of them, because the design required a male and a female produced simultaneously so that the reproduction problem would be solved from the beginning. They were made in the mountain, in Ninhursag's facility, in a controlled environment, and they were tested for a period before they were released to the mines. When they were released, they worked. They worked well. They worked better, in some respects, than the Igigi had worked, because they had been designed for the work, and their bodies were adapted to it in ways the Igigi bodies had not been. They were smaller, which meant they could reach seams in the rock the Igigi had needed heavy machinery to access. They were sturdier per unit of mass. They needed less rest. They needed less food. They reproduced quickly, and they accepted, at first, the command of the family without question, because they had been designed to do so, and because the design included a component that made command feel natural to them, the way breathing feels natural. That was the beginning of the human species. That was, Enki said in the second statement, the truth of your origin. You were not made in love. You were made in a labor emergency by a designer who was breaking his own family's rules, with a genetic contribution from a female relative of that designer, and you were released into mines to extract a metal that was needed to save a world you have never seen. That is what happened. That is what your bones contain the memory of, even if your minds do not. The love story came later. It was invented, Enki said, by the priests. And it was invented specifically because the truth of your creation was too degrading for a species that had, over time, grown large enough and complex enough to matter to the family as something more than a labor force. When you became more than labor, the story of your creation had to be rewritten. The truth was buried. The love story was placed on top. And what you inherited, as a species, was the myth, not the record. The record survives. Enki placed it here, in the second statement, so that it would not be lost. He said, at the end of the second statement, that anyone who reads this and doubts it should look at the shape of the human body and ask a simple question. Why is the human body so well suited to work with the hands, to walk on two legs for long distances, to endure heat and cold and exhaustion in a way that no closely related primate can endure? The answer, Enki said, is that the body was designed for those things. It was designed for the mine. It was designed for the field. It was designed for endurance labor over long shifts in difficult conditions. And every time a human being finds themselves, in the modern world, doing work that punishes their body but that their body seems strangely built to survive, they are experiencing the design that Enki and Ninhursag settled on in the mountain, in the emergency, when the Igigi had walked out and the family had no other option. That was the second thing Enki said. That is why you were made. Remember it, he said, when you hear the third. The third thing Enki said. This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. The flood was not a divine judgment. The flood was a policy vote. And the vote was taken not because humans had sinned, but because the family had decided the human experiment had become inconvenient. He said this third because it is the point at which every human religion begins to diverge from the actual record, and he wanted the divergence exposed before it could take root in the reader's mind. Every flood tradition that survives in the ancient world says the same thing. The gods, or the god, sent a flood because humans had become wicked. Humans had grown corrupt. Humans had filled the earth with violence. The moral order of the universe required a cleansing. The waters were the cleansing. Only the righteous survived, because the God who sent the flood was also the God who saved the righteous, and the surviving righteous became the seed of a purified humanity that would begin again in obedience to the moral order that had been temporarily violated. That is the story. That is the story that appears in the tablets, in the scrolls, in the sacred books of every civilization that inherited any fragment of the memory. And the story, Enki said, is false in every part. There was no moral judgment. There was no wickedness. There was no cleansing. There was a council meeting. The council meeting took place in the family's assembly hall, which the fragments call the Ubshukina, a word that means the great gathering place, the room where the seven who decide sit down together and issue rulings that bind the entire family. The seven who decide were the seven senior members of the family, and Enki was one of them, and Enlil was one of them, and An was one of them, and the other four were figures whose roles Enki would develop in later statements. The seven met to consider what to do about a problem. The problem was noise. That is the word he used, and he insisted on it, and he said the later scribes would try to translate it into other words, but the original word was noise. The humans had become numerous. They had multiplied beyond the initial population that had been designed. They had spread out from the mines into the plains and the river valleys. They had built settlements. They had built more settlements. They had built villages that became towns and towns that became cities, and the cities produced sound, constant sound. The sound of markets and workshops and children and celebrations and arguments and animals and vehicles and machinery. The sound rose up from the surface of the planet and reached the ears of the family members who lived above the surface. In the elevated compounds the family had built for itself on the mountain plateaus and in the high places. And the sound, Enlil said in the council, was becoming unbearable. Enki, in the third statement, was careful to explain that the complaint was not about volume alone. It was about the fact that the noise represented a species that had, in Enlil's view, exceeded its purpose. The humans had been made to work the mines. The mines were now largely automated, because the family had, over the generations, transferred much of the extraction work to machines and had left the humans to less critical roles. The humans, no longer fully occupied by the original labor purpose, had turned to other activities. They had developed art. They had developed music. They had developed religion, which was itself an ironic development, because the religion they developed was addressed to the very family members who were now complaining about them. They had developed trade and law and government and everything that human beings develop when they are given time and materials and the ability to organize. And Enlil, watching this from above, watching the species he had never wanted made in the first place become more elaborate and more independent and more visible every year, decided that the experiment had run long enough. The humans were no longer necessary. The humans were, in his phrase from the council record, no longer within their design parameters, and the humans, according to his proposal, should be removed. His proposal was direct. Erase them. Not all of them, because that would be wasteful, but most of them. Send a global catastrophe. The family had the capability. The family had used the capability before, in earlier operations on other planets, when a population had needed to be reduced. The specific mechanism this time would be a flood. A rapid melting of the ice caps, engineered by manipulating the ocean temperature and the atmospheric conditions in a coordinated sequence, would produce a sea level rise of a magnitude sufficient to destroy every coastal city, every river valley civilization, every population center that had grown along the water. Since human beings had, in their expansion, concentrated themselves overwhelmingly along coasts and rivers, the flood would eliminate the majority of the population in a single event. The survivors, scattered in the highlands, would be reduced to a much smaller number, and that smaller number would return to a simpler condition, a condition more consistent with the original purpose, a condition in which the noise would drop back to acceptable levels, and the family could continue its operations without the daily irritation of a species that had grown beyond its station. The proposal was tabled. The seven debated it, and Enki, in the third statement, gave the full record of the debate as he remembered it. The debate lasted, in the family's own reckoning, for a period equivalent to several human years, because the family did not rush decisions of this magnitude, and because there were technical questions about the flood engineering that needed to be answered before the vote could be taken. But the debate, in the end, was not really a debate about whether to do it. It was a debate about who would be inconvenienced. Some of the family had human favorites. Certain lineages had produced kings and priests and craftsmen who served particular family members and whose loss would be a personal loss to those members. Some family members had bred with humans, in defiance of the original rules, and had produced hybrid offspring whose fate under a global flood would be uncertain. Some family members simply enjoyed the humans as an amusement, the way a person might enjoy watching a particularly clever pet, and did not want the amusement removed. All of these members raised objections. All of the objections were, in the end, addressed by exceptions and compromises. Certain humans would be warned in advance. Certain lineages would be spared. Certain regions would be protected from the worst of the flood. The vote, when it came, was 5 in favor and 2 against. Enki and one other member, whose identity Enki did not disclose in the third statement, voted against. Everyone else voted in favor, and the family, having voted, was bound by the vote. But Enki was bound only in the family sense. He was bound not to interfere with the operation of the flood. He was not bound to keep his mouth shut about it. And he found, in the vote and its aftermath, a loophole that his brother, in retrospect, should have anticipated and did not. Enki was bound not to warn humans. He was not bound not to speak in the presence of humans. And so, according to the third statement, Enki went to the city of Sharupak, where he had a favored priest, a man whose name in the earliest fragments is written variously as Ziusudra or Atrahasis, or in the later version as Utnapishtim, And in the version the modern world knows best as Noah, he went to this man's house. He did not enter the house. He stood outside the reed wall of the house and he spoke, not to the man, but to the wall. He said, "Wall, listen. Wall, hear me." And in the hearing of the wall, he described the flood that was coming. He described the timing. He described the survival strategy. He described the exact dimensions of the vessel that would need to be built to survive the water. He described what animals should be taken, and what supplies should be loaded, and what preparations should be made. He spoke to the wall in a voice loud enough for anyone inside the house to hear, and he trusted that the man inside the house would understand what was being said and would act on it. The man understood. The man acted. The vessel was built. The animals were loaded. The flood came. And when the waters receded, and the family looked down from above and saw that a vessel had survived, that a human line had preserved itself, that the erasure had not been complete, they knew immediately who had done it. Only one member of the family had the wisdom, the timing, and the motive to have arranged such a survival. Only one member had voted against the flood and had reason to sabotage it. Only one member had spoken to a wall while a priest listened. Enlil, when he understood what had happened, was, according to the third statement, in a state of rage that took the other family members days to calm. He accused Enki of betrayal. He accused Enki of violating the vote. He accused Enki of endangering the family's control over the planet by preserving a lineage that would remember the flood and would tell the story and would eventually understand what the family had done. Enki did not deny the charge. He said, in the council meeting that followed the flood, that he had done what he believed was right, and that if the family wanted to punish him, they could punish him. But he would not apologize for having preserved the species he had made. The family did not punish him. Not then. Not officially. Because the family understood, in a way Enlil did not want to admit publicly, that Enki had done them all a favor. The metal shipments to the home world had continued to depend, in ways that had not been fully accounted for in the flood plan, on human labor at certain refinement stages. If humans had been entirely eliminated, several of those refinement processes would have collapsed, and the shipments would have been interrupted. Enki's preservation of a small human population had, in effect, kept the operation running. Enlil could not admit this without conceding that the flood plan had been poorly thought out. So Enlil said nothing. He absorbed the humiliation. He accepted the survival. But he never forgave his brother, and he never forgot the moment when Enki had stood outside the reed wall and had told the priest what to do. From that moment forward, the third statement said, the war between the two brothers, which had been a war conducted mostly through argument and delay, became a war conducted through more serious means. Enlil began to look for ways to undermine Enki's influence with humans. Enki began to look for ways to protect the human lineages he had saved. And the human species, unknowing, became the battleground on which the family fight would be conducted for the next several thousand years. That, Enki said, is what the flood actually was. Not a judgment, a vote, not a cleansing. A population reduction, not the will of a righteous God. The decision of a divided family, taken in a council chamber, over a matter of noise, with dissent from two members and a subsequent unauthorized rescue by one of the dissenters. Every human tradition that describes it otherwise, Enki said, is describing it the way the winning faction wanted it described. The losing faction, the faction that included Enki himself, wanted it described the way he has just described it. And he set it down here, in the third statement, because if the true account were ever lost, the family would have succeeded in erasing not only the humans who died in the flood, but also the memory of why they died. The memory, he said, is more important than the numbers. The numbers can be replaced. The memory cannot. Keep the memory. Keep it in this form. Do not let the priests take it away from you. He ended the third statement with a note that has puzzled every commentator who has studied it. He said, the flood was the first vote. There will be others. The family does not stop voting, and each vote takes a form that the humans of the moment do not recognize as a vote until it is over. Watch, he said, for the votes. They come disguised. They come as weather. They come as plague. They come as sudden shifts in the climate that no one can quite explain. They come as wars that no one wanted and no one can trace to a clear origin. When something happens on this planet that seems too large to have a natural cause and too coordinated to be an accident, ask whether a vote has been taken. Ask whether the family is met. Ask whether the noise, or whatever the current complaint is, has reached the threshold at which action becomes acceptable. The flood was not the last vote. The flood was the first vote that used water. There will be votes that use other means, and you will not know one is happening until it is already underway. The fourth thing Enki said. This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. The tablets of destinies are a real object. They are not a metaphor. They are not a poetic image for divine will. They are a physical device, and whoever holds them rules. And the story of the family fight is, in large part, the story of who has held them, when they have held them, and what happened when they were taken by someone who was not supposed to have them. He said this forth because the third statement had raised the question of authority. If the family votes, if the family issues decisions, if the family imposes floods and other measures on the human world, on what basis does the family claim the right to do so? The priests had told humans that the right was intrinsic. The gods are gods, and gods rule by nature, and no further justification is required. Enki said this was a convenient answer, but not a true one. The family, he said, rules by possession of an object. The object confers the authority. The authority is not intrinsic. It is invested in the object, and whoever holds the object can, in principle, wield the authority regardless of their birth or rank or personal qualities. That is why the object is guarded. That is why the object has been fought over. That is why, in the earliest fragments, the greatest crimes described in the family record are always crimes against the object, never crimes against persons. Because a person can be replaced, the object, in the family's understanding, cannot. The object had a name in the earliest fragments. The name is written variously in the different tablet traditions, but the reading Enki himself preferred was Dur and Ki, which means the bond of heaven and earth, or the tie between above and below, or in a more functional translation, the link that keeps the upper and lower operations coordinated. That is what the object was. It was a coordination device. It was, in Enki's technical description, a piece of equipment that stored the master parameters for the operation the family was running on this planet. The parameters included the schedules for the metal extraction, the assignments of the various personnel, the locations of the family's installations, the codes that would activate or shut down each installation, the records of every decision the family had made and every ruling the council had issued, and, most importantly, the identifications of who had authority over what. If you held the tablets, you could read the parameters. If you could read the parameters, you could give orders that would be recognized as valid by every automated system the family had ever built. If you could give orders that would be recognized as valid, you were, functionally, in command of the entire operation, regardless of your rank in the family. That is what made the tablets dangerous. In the earliest days of the operation, when Anne was fully present on the planet, the tablets sat in Anne's own compound, and only Anne handled them. When Anne left the planet for extended periods, he would designate a keeper, and the keeper would hold the tablets in trust until Anne returned. The keeper was chosen from the highest ranks of the family, and the keeper was, by protocol, required to consult with the full council before making any decision that would draw on the tablet's authority. The system worked for a long time because everyone accepted the protocol and no one attempted to use the tablets outside of council decisions. But protocols, Enki said, are only as strong as the willingness of the participants to observe them, and the willingness of the participants to observe the tablet's protocol began to erode as the family's internal tensions grew. The first serious violation, according to the fourth statement, was not attempted by any of the senior family members. It was attempted by a subordinate. His name in the earliest fragments is Zu, or in later fragments Anzu, and he was described as a servant of Enlil, a bird-form messenger who was trusted with access to the inner rooms of Enlil's compound because he was considered too lowly to constitute a threat. Zu observed, over a long period of service, the way the tablets were handled and stored and used. He observed the moments when they were unguarded. He observed the codes that were spoken to unlock the chamber in which they were kept. He observed, and he waited longer, and he did nothing. And then, one morning, when Anne was away and Enlil had gone down to a lower chamber to bathe and had left the tablets on a table in the upper room, Zu entered the room, picked up the tablets, and left with them. The theft was discovered within an hour. Enlil, coming up from the bath, saw the empty table. He raised the alarm. The compound was searched. Zu was not found. Word went out through the family that the tablets had been taken, and every member of the family, everyone in every corner of the operation, dropped what they were doing and began to search. They searched for days. They searched for weeks. They found Zu, eventually, in a mountain in the north, where he had gone to hide and where he was when they found him, attempting to figure out how to actually use the tablets. He had not yet succeeded. He had learned enough, in his years of service, to know the codes for basic access, but the deeper functions required knowledge he did not possess. and he had been sitting on the mountain, holding the tablets, unable to activate them, for the entire period of the search. When the family arrived at the mountain, Zu had a choice. He could surrender the tablets and face whatever punishment the family would impose. He could destroy the tablets and deprive everyone of their use. He chose to fight. He raised the tablets above his head in a gesture the fragments describe as defiant, and he attempted to command the family to leave him alone. The family did not leave. The family had brought weapons, Enki said, and the weapons were of a type that Zu had never seen, because they were weapons that belonged to the senior members and had not been shown to servants. The weapons were used, Zu was killed, the tablets were recovered. And the family, when it gathered afterward to discuss what had happened, understood something new. It understood that the tablets could be stolen. It understood that a servant, with sufficient patience and observation, could carry off the family's central instrument of authority. It understood that the entire structure of family rule, which had been assumed to rest on the family's own reliability, actually rested on a physical object that could be moved. And this understanding changed the family. It made the family paranoid. It made the family suspicious of every servant, every subordinate, every ally. It caused the family to redesign the tablet's security. It caused the family to add layers of authentication that would prevent any future Zu from using the tablets even if he managed to steal them. And it caused, most fatefully, the family to begin arguing among themselves about who should be trusted to hold the tablets in Ant's absence. Because if a servant could steal them, then a senior family member could too. And the incident had made everyone aware that no one, not even the closest brother, could be fully trusted. Enlil, as the designated keeper, held the tablets by default. But Enki, in the fourth statement, described a series of episodes in which Enlil's custody was challenged, in which alternative keepers were proposed, in which An himself was petitioned to reconsider the arrangement. Enki was part of some of these challenges, and he was open about it in the fourth statement. He said he had, on more than one occasion, argued in council that the tablets should not remain in the sole custody of any one member of the family, that they should be distributed across multiple keepers with different keys, so that no single keeper could act unilaterally. His argument was rejected each time, because Enlil argued that distributing the tablets would create administrative chaos, and because An, when he was consulted, preferred the simplicity of a single custody, so the tablets stayed with Enlil. But the fact that the argument had been raised, the fact that Enki had made it publicly, and the fact that other family members had supported it quietly, meant that Enlil never again held the tablets without knowing that his custody was contested. And Enlil, Enki said, responded to that awareness in a way that shaped every decision he made thereafter. He became protective of the tablets to the point of obsession. He began to make decisions unilaterally, without full council consultation, on the grounds that his custody of the tablets gave him the authority to do so. He began, in effect, to rule as if the object had become an extension of his own body, and any challenge to his handling of it was a challenge to his personhood. This is how the family began to shift, Enki said, from a council-based rule to something more like a single ruler with an object of power. And this shift more than any other single development, is what set the stage for the wars that followed. Because once Enlil had established that possession of the tablets constituted authority, it followed that anyone who wanted to challenge his authority would need to take the tablets. And several members of the family, including Enki's own son Marduk in a later generation, would come to exactly that conclusion. The tablets would be taken again, the tablets would be recovered again, the tablets would be lost, and found, and lost, and found, and each cycle of loss and recovery would produce a war that reshaped the entire operation. Enki, in the fourth statement, listed several of these cycles in outline, and he said he would return to them in later statements when he described the wars themselves in detail. For now, in the fourth statement, he wanted only to establish the principle. The tablets are real. They confer authority. The authority is not intrinsic to any family member. It is held in the object. And the entire history of the family, and by extension the entire history of everything the family has done to this planet and to the humans on it, is the history of who held the object at each moment and what they did with the authority the object gave them. He added one more detail before ending the fourth statement, and the detail is the reason the fourth statement was, according to Enki himself, the second most dangerous of the 12. He said that the tablets, at the time he was writing the fourth statement, were no longer in Enlil's custody. They had been taken. They had been taken not by a servant, not by an outsider, but by a family member. The taking had happened recently, in the family's own reckoning, and it had produced a crisis that was still unresolved at the moment the fourth statement was being set down. The family was in the middle of an active dispute about the taking. Enki did not name the taker in the fourth statement, because to name the taker publicly would have committed him to a side in the dispute, and he wanted to remain, at least in this statement, above the immediate conflict. But he said that the identity of the taker would become clear as the later statements unfolded, and that the reader who read all 12 in order would be able to reconstruct, from the accumulated details, exactly who had taken the tablets, why they had taken them, and what the family had done in response. The taker, Enki said, was still alive at the moment of writing. The tablets were still in the taker's possession. The situation was ongoing, and this fact that the fourth statement was describing not just past history but a live and unresolved family crisis, was one of the reasons the family would eventually decide that Enki's voice had to be silenced. Because as long as Enki was talking, the crisis could not be resolved on the family's own terms. Enki's testimony would leak into the human record. Humans would know, and the family's ability to manage the crisis quietly, without external witnesses, would be compromised. That, Enki said, is why the fourth statement matters. Not because it tells you what the tablets are. That is important, but it is only the beginning. The fourth statement matters because it tells you that the crisis is ongoing. The tablets are not, at this moment, in the hands of the being who is supposed to hold them. The authority is disputed. The family is fighting about it, and every event you see in the world around you, every unexplained shift in power, every mysterious rise or fall of a nation, every moment when things seem to be moving according to a plan that no human government has authored, is happening in the context of that ongoing dispute. Someone holds the tablets. That someone is not who the family originally designated. The family is trying to get them back. The taker is trying to keep them. And the humans, as they have always been, are caught in the middle, unaware that a family fight is taking place above them, unaware that the outcome of that fight will determine what happens to their species over the coming generations. Watch, Enki said, for the signs of the dispute. Watch for the moments when the pattern of events seems to shift in ways that no human decision can explain. And ask yourself, always ask yourself, who holds the tablets right now? Because that is the question that governs everything else. The fifth thing, Enki said, this is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. There are 7 weapons. The family brought them from the homeworld, when the family first came here. 6 of the 7 have been used on this planet, and every use is recorded in some human tradition somewhere, though the recording has been so distorted by the passage of time that most modern readers do not recognize the weapons for what they were. The 7th has never been used. The 7th is being held in reserve. And the question of when, or whether, the 7th will be used is a question the family has never agreed on, and it is at the center of the argument that is currently dividing them. He said this 5th because the previous 4 statements had established the frame, the labor origin, the flood vote, and the tablets, and he now had to introduce the physical means by which the family enforces its decisions. A council can vote, a ruler can command, but without the ability to compel, the vote and the command are only opinions. The family, when it came here, brought the ability to compel. It brought weapons. And the weapons were not the primitive weapons the ancient world imagined when it later tried to describe them. They were not swords or spears or arrows or fire. They were something else. Something that predated any technology the human species has ever developed, and that, in Enki's judgment, will not be matched by human technology for many generations to come. The first weapon Enki named was called, in the earliest fragments, the wind of the mountain. In later traditions, it became the west wind, or the whirlwind, or the storm that walks. It was, in Enki's functional description, a device that generated an atmospheric disturbance on a controlled scale. The disturbance could be as small as a single storm cell targeted at a specific settlement, or as large as a continental scale event that would flatten forests and level cities across an entire region. The device operated by manipulating pressure and temperature differentials in the atmosphere and directing the resulting energy release along a chosen path. It had been used, Enki said, several times in the operation's history. The most famous use, from the human perspective, was during the second dynasty of the city of Akkad, when the entire empire was destroyed in what the humans of the time described as a curse from the god Enlil, and what was in fact a weather event engineered by Enlil personally, using this weapon, in response to what he considered an insult from the ruling king. The empire fell in less than a generation. The land was rendered infertile for many years. The population scattered, and the weapon was returned to storage, having accomplished its purpose. The second weapon was called the Shining Hand. It was a directed energy device. It projected a concentrated beam of a form of radiation the fragments describe as brighter than the sun and heavier than fire, and the beam could be aimed with precision at a specific target from a great distance. The weapon had been used, Enki said, during the war between his own house and Enlil's forces in the period he referred to as the Third Succession Dispute, when a fortress belonging to one of Enki's sons had been destroyed in a single strike that left the fortress walls standing but killed every living being inside it. The bodies were not burned, they were not crushed. They were, in the description Enki gave in the fifth statement, undone at a level his own scientific vocabulary did not fully cover, and he said he preferred not to describe the effect in detail because the description would be more disturbing than useful. The weapon was returned to storage after that use. It has not been used since. The third weapon was the underwater strike. It was a device that could be deployed beneath the surface of the ocean and detonated at depth, producing a wave that would radiate outward from the detonation point and, when the wave reached a coastline, rise to a height sufficient to inundate a city and everything behind it for many miles inland. The weapon had been used on multiple occasions, Enki said, and he specifically identified two of the historical tsunamis that human traditions still remember as the aftermath of this weapon rather than as natural events. He did not name the specific coastlines that had been targeted, because the identifications would draw attention to certain archaeological sites that the family, for reasons he would explain later, preferred to keep unexcavated. But he said that if a reader of the fifth statement wanted to identify the targets on their own, the reader should look for coastlines where the sudden disappearance of a civilization coincides with sediment layers, indicating a massive water event, and the reader would find, in the pattern of those coincidences, the traces of the weapon's use. The fourth weapon was the Trembling Stone. It was a device that could induce seismic activity along a chosen fault line, timed to release accumulated tectonic energy on demand. The device did not create the earthquake from nothing. It triggered earthquakes that would have happened eventually anyway, but it triggered them at the moment of the family's choosing, in the magnitude the family wanted, and directed the resulting shockwaves toward the target the family had selected. This weapon had been used, Enki said, more frequently than any of the others, because it left almost no evidence that a weapon had been used at all. An earthquake looks like an earthquake, whether it was triggered or spontaneous, and only the family itself and the operators of the device knew which earthquakes on the human record had been natural and which had been produced. Enki said the number of triggered earthquakes was in the many dozens over the course of the operation, and he named several cities that had fallen to this weapon, though he warned that some of the identifications would be controversial because the cities in question have long been assumed by human historians to have fallen for other reasons. The fifth weapon was the plague. It was, Enki was careful to explain, not a single device, but a category of devices, because the family had brought several biological agents from the homeworld and had, over the operation, developed additional agents from local biological material. The agents were designed to be released into human populations in a targeted way, to reduce specific populations without affecting neighboring populations, and to burn out after a specified period so that the depopulation would be selective rather than general. This weapon had been used many times. The great plagues of the ancient world, the ones that recurred in cycles and that human medical knowledge could not explain, were, in Enki's account, the traces of this weapon's use. He named the specific outbreak that had ended the Second Assyrian Empire. He named the outbreak that had, in a later generation, decimated the Egyptian coastal cities during a particular succession crisis in the family. He said the biological agents were still available. They had never been destroyed. They had been stored in a facility whose location he did not specify, but which he said still existed at the moment of his writing, and which would still exist, he predicted, long after the humans reading his testimony had themselves become dust. The agents could be redeployed at any time, and they would be, he said, when the family judged the next reduction to be necessary. The sixth weapon was the one the fragments call, most consistently, the seven that flew, or the seven that split. It was, Enki said, the most terrible of the six that had been used, and it was the one that came closest, in the description of its effects, to what the humans of the modern age would recognize as a nuclear weapon. It was a device that released, in a single detonation, a quantity of energy sufficient to obliterate a city and to render the surrounding land uninhabitable for a period of many human lifetimes. The device had been used, Enki said, exactly one time on this planet, and the use had been so catastrophic in its aftermath that even the family, which had authorized the use, had regretted it afterward. The city that had been destroyed was called, in the earliest fragments, by a name that has been variously translated but that the modern reader would most recognize under the compound designation Sodom and Gomorrah. The story that survives in the human religious record of two cities destroyed by fire from the sky because of the wickedness of their inhabitants is a distorted memory of what Enki called the greatest single application of force in the entire history of the operation. The cities were destroyed, Enki said, because they sat on top of, or immediately adjacent to, an installation that the family had built for a purpose he would describe in a later statement, and the humans in the cities had, through a combination of curiosity and ambition, come to understand what the installation was for, and had begun to attempt to access it. The family could not allow the access. The family voted. The vote was to eliminate the cities and the installation together, and the sixth weapon was chosen because it would accomplish both objectives in a single strike. The strike was carried out. The cities and everything around them were reduced to a condition Enki described as glass and bone. The surrounding land, which had been fertile, became salt. The nearest surviving human settlements interpreted the event as divine punishment. The interpretation was allowed to stand. And the sixth weapon was returned to storage, and has not been used since. Enki said, in the fifth statement, that after the use of the sixth weapon, the family had held a meeting at which every member present had, one by one, expressed the view that no such weapon should ever be used again. The meeting had not resulted in a formal prohibition, because the family did not make formal prohibitions of that kind, but it had resulted in an informal understanding that the sixth weapon and the still unused seventh weapon would be held in storage indefinitely, and would not be considered for redeployment except under the most extreme circumstances. What circumstances would qualify as extreme enough had never been defined, and this vagueness, Enki said, was itself a source of ongoing tension. Because if the threshold was undefined, then any member of the family who could persuade the council that a threshold had been reached could, in theory, unlock the storage and authorize a use. And there were members of the family, Enki said, who were beginning to argue exactly that. Who were beginning to say that the current conditions on the planet, the noise of the humans, the growth of the human population, the increasing capacity of humans to develop technologies of their own, constituted a threshold that justified consideration of the seventh weapon. Enki opposed these members. He opposed them openly, in every council meeting where the argument was raised. But he was, in his own estimate, in a minority. And he set down the fifth statement, in part, so that the humans reading it would know that the seventh weapon existed and that the argument for its use was being made, right now, in the family's own councils, and that the outcome of that argument was, as of the moment of writing, undetermined. The seventh weapon, Enki said, is different from the other six in a way that requires careful explanation. The other six weapons act on physical things. They kill bodies, they destroy cities, they poison land, they induce earthquakes and floods and disease. They are, in the family's own technical language, kinetic devices, in the broad sense that they produce measurable physical effects on measurable physical targets. The seventh weapon does not act on physical things. Or rather, it acts on physical things only indirectly. Its primary action is on something else. Something the family had a word for in its own language, a word that Enki said had no clean equivalent in any human tongue, but that could be approximated as the coordinated field of memory that binds a species together across time. The seventh weapon acts on that field. It disrupts the field. It, in effect, unbinds a species from itself. The individual members remain physically alive. The bodies do not die. But the connection that allowed the members to recognize each other as members of the same species, to communicate across generations, to accumulate knowledge, to build on what previous generations had built, is severed. The species becomes, in Enki's phrase, a scattering of unrelated persons who happen to share a biology. He said this was the reason the seventh weapon had never been used. It was not that the family lacked the will to use it. It was that the family had, in its earlier operations on other planets, seen what the weapon did, and the sight had disturbed even the most hardened of the family members. A species that has been unbinded, Enki said, does not recover. There is no path back. The individual members live out their natural lifetimes, and they die. And their children are born without the field, and the children's children are born without the field, and the species continues, biologically, but it is no longer the same species, in any meaningful sense. It is a population of animals that share a genome. It is not a people. It cannot be a people again. And the family, on the one previous planet where the seventh weapon had been used, had walked away afterward and had never returned to that planet because the sight of what remained was, in the family's own words, too much. But there were members of the family, Enki said, who now argued that the seventh weapon should be considered for use on this planet. The argument was made, he said, not out of cruelty, but out of a specific calculation. The humans, these members argued, were on a trajectory that would soon make them ungovernable. The humans were developing technologies of their own. The humans were beginning to look outward, toward the stars, toward the family's own homeworld. The humans were beginning, in effect, to constitute a species that could, within a manageable number of generations, become a competitor to the family itself. And the family, if it wanted to avoid competing with a species of its own making, needed to act before the trajectory became irreversible. The seventh weapon, these members argued, was the only intervention that would work at the required scale without producing a physical extinction that would make the planet unusable for future family operations. Use the seventh weapon. Unbind the human species from itself. Preserve the biological population as a labor pool. Prevent the coordinated development that was leading toward competition. And do it soon, before the humans had progressed to the point where the weapon would no longer be effective. Enki opposed this argument, and he set down his opposition in the fifth statement in the strongest terms he permitted himself. He said the argument was correct in its assessment of the trajectory, but wrong in its assessment of the remedy. Yes, humans were developing outward. Yes, humans would eventually reach a stage at which they could not be controlled by the family in the way they had been controlled in the past. But the correct response, Enki said, was not to unbind them. The correct response was to let them develop, and to plan for a new relationship in which the family would deal with humans as something closer to equals than to property. The unbinding, Enki said, would preserve the family's control in the short term, but would destroy something that the family did not yet fully understand and that, once destroyed, could not be recreated. He said that in the councils, and he said it again in the fifth statement, and he said it a third time in the closing lines of the fifth statement, because he wanted the humans reading it to know that at least one member of the family had spoken for them, publicly and consistently, at every meeting where the question had been raised. Before we move on, stop for a second. What you just heard about the 7 weapons only makes sense on the full timeline, next to the 6 resets before it. Every arrival was scheduled. Every schedule leaves a trace. It is all in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. QR code is on your screen. He ended the 5th statement with the note he had begun to develop in the 4th. The question of the 7th weapon, he said, is not a historical question. It is a live question. It is being argued right now in the councils of the family. It has not been decided. And the outcome, he said, will depend in part on what the humans reading his testimony do with what they now know. Because if the humans know that the weapon exists, and know what it does, and know that certain family members are advocating for its use, then the humans can take steps of their own to influence the outcome. What steps, exactly? He did not specify. He said only that a species that knows what is being planned against it has options that a species in ignorance does not have. And he said that the 5th statement was, in part, his attempt to give the humans that knowledge, so that the options would exist, so that the outcome would not be settled entirely by the family, so that the humans themselves would have some part in what happened to them next. That, Enki said, is the 5th thing. 6 weapons used, 1 weapon held in reserve, a debate about the 7th that has not been settled. A species that will now, thanks to this testimony, at least know what is being weighed. Remember all of it, he said, when you hear the 6th, because the 6th thing is about the stars, and the 6th thing changes the way you will hear everything that comes after. The 6th thing, Enki said, this is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. The gods lied about the stars. The home world of the family is not where the priests will later tell you it is. The direction the priests will point, the constellation the priests will name, the star the priests will identify as the origin, is a decoy. The real origin is elsewhere, and the reason the decoy has been maintained, for as long as it has been maintained, is that the real origin is a place the family does not want humans to find. Because when the humans, eventually, become capable of looking there, the family does not want a welcoming committee waiting for them. He said this 6th because the previous statements had brought the human reader as far as the family's operations on this planet, and the 6th was necessary to extend the frame outward to the larger question of where the family had come from and what the relationship was between this planet and the place the family called home. He said the question was, in one sense, simple. The family came from a specific star system. That star system existed. It could, in principle, be pointed to. In another sense, the question was extremely complicated, because the star system the family had come from was not, in the family's own testimony, the star system the family wanted humans to associate with them. There was a difference between the origin, which was a real place, and the story of the origin, which was a fabrication designed for human consumption. And the fabrication had been maintained so consistently, for so long, and by so many different priesthoods, across so many different civilizations, that even human scholars who considered themselves skeptical of religious tradition tended to accept the fabrication as the working hypothesis of where the ancient gods, if they existed at all, had claimed to be from. The fabrication, Enki said, involved a specific pattern of constellations. The priests were instructed, in the earliest priest training, to teach that the gods had descended from a particular grouping of stars in the northern sky, a grouping that the ancient astronomers could identify easily, and that could be pointed to by any priest during any ritual without ambiguity. The grouping was chosen for the fabrication precisely because it was easy to identify. It was bright. It was in a position that any observer at a temperate latitude could locate on a clear night. It was, in effect, a convenient landmark. And the choice of a convenient landmark, Enki said, was itself the tell. Because the real origin, the real star system, was not convenient. It was not easy to see. It was in a part of the sky that most human astronomical traditions had not paid attention to, because the stars there were dim and the region was, from the perspective of naked eye observation, unremarkable. The real origin, Enki said, was in a system that the family's own name for referred to a specific dwarf star with a companion, a binary system, in which the family's home planet orbited the primary at a distance that placed it in the habitable zone but with an orbital period much longer than the human year. The system was not visible to the unaided human eye, and it would not become visible to human astronomy until the humans developed telescopes of a certain size and resolution, at which point the family expected the identification to become possible, and at which point the family had planned various measures would be in place to ensure that the identification did not lead humans to attempt travel to the system, because the system was not prepared to receive human visitors and the family had specific reasons for wanting it to remain unvisited. Enki did not, in the sixth statement, give the exact coordinates of the real system, and he explained why. He said that if he gave the coordinates in a document that would circulate among humans, the coordinates would eventually be verified, and the verification would prompt exactly the kind of investigation the family wanted to prevent. So he described the system in general terms only. He said it was a binary. He said the primary was a dwarf. He said the habitable planet was smaller than this planet and denser, with a stronger gravitational field, which had shaped the family's own bodies over many generations to be sturdier and more compact than the equivalent human anatomy. He said the orbital period was long, which meant that the family's own units of time, when translated to human years, produced numbers that seemed impossibly long, and which was the reason that the ages of the antediluvian patriarchs in the human religious tradition, the ages that seemed to human readers absurdly extended, were in fact literal translations of family lifespans as measured in the family's own calendar. The ages were not exaggerations. They were conversions from a longer time unit to a shorter one, and the resulting numbers looked strange because they were, essentially, the same lifespan expressed in a different currency. Why the lie about the origin, Enki said, is a question with several answers, and he wanted to give each answer in turn. The first answer was practical. If humans knew where the family came from, humans would eventually go there. The family did not want humans going there. There were reasons involving the internal politics of the family's homeworld that made a human arrival, at any point in the foreseeable future, unwelcome. Some members of the family's home government, who had opposed the establishment of the operation on this planet, would use a human arrival as evidence that the operation had been mismanaged and that the mismanagement had produced consequences that were now spilling back onto the home world. The family members who had championed the operation, and who had staked their reputations on its successful conclusion, did not want to be embarrassed by a human delegation arriving unannounced and demanding to know what had been done to their planet. So the origin was hidden, and the hiding was intended to persist until the family had, in its own time, arranged for a properly managed disclosure. The second answer was strategic. The family did not want to give humans a target. As long as humans did not know where the family came from, Humans could not, in any scenario of future conflict, direct any offensive capacity toward the family's home. The family, Enki said, did not currently expect humans to develop offensive capacities that could reach interstellar distances anytime soon. But the family also did not want to bet the survival of its home on the assumption that human capabilities would remain limited forever. History, Enki said in a phrase that recurred several times in the 12 statements, is not the friend of confident predictions. Species change faster than one expects. Technologies emerge from unexpected directions. And the family, in Enki's account, had lost operations on other planets in the past precisely because it had assumed that the local population could never become a threat and had woken up one day to discover that the assumption had been wrong. This planet and this human species, the family was determined not to underestimate in the same way. So the origin was hidden. And the hiding was a hedge against a future in which humans might, for reasons the family could not currently foresee, decide to act against the family in ways that would matter. The third answer was theological, though Enki did not use that word. The third answer was that the priests, once the fabrication had been established, had come to depend on it. The priests taught the constellation. The priests pointed to the sky. The priests told the humans that the gods came from there. And the priests built their entire ritual authority on the fact that they, the priests, knew where the gods came from, and the ordinary humans did not. If the truth were disclosed, if the constellation were revealed to be a decoy, the priests would be discredited. The rituals would collapse. The temple economies, which had grown to depend on the constant flow of offerings from humans who believed the constellation was the origin, would fail. The family did not necessarily care about the fate of the priesthoods, but the family recognized that the priesthoods had, over time, become a stabilizing mechanism for human societies, and that a sudden collapse of the priesthoods would produce disorder that would eventually reach the family in ways the family preferred to avoid. So the lie was maintained not only because the family wanted it maintained, but because the priests, once they had built their authority on it, could not afford to see it exposed. Enki said, in the sixth statement, that the maintenance of the lie had been so successful, for so long, that even members of the family's own younger generations had begun to forget or to be told inaccurate versions of the true origin. The younger family members born on this planet, born after the operation had been running for many generations, had grown up with the fabrication as their working assumption. They knew, in a general way, that the origin story they told to humans was not the whole truth. But they had not been given the whole truth themselves, because the whole truth was considered dangerous even within the family, and only the senior members, only An and Enlil and Enki and a small number of others, possessed the actual coordinates and the actual history of the migration from the true origin to this planet. This compartmentalization of knowledge, Enki said, was itself a source of internal tension, because the younger family members resented the fact that they were being kept in ignorance about their own origin, and they had begun, in various small ways, to attempt to piece together the truth for themselves. The sixth statement ended with a specific instruction to the human reader. Enki said, "Do not attempt to find the true origin from the details I have given you. The details are deliberately partial. If you try to reconstruct the coordinates from what I have said, you will produce a false identification, and the false identification will lead you to a place where nothing is, and you will conclude that I was wrong, and you will lose confidence in the rest of what I am telling you. That is not what I want. The details of the true origin are not important for your purposes. What is important is that you know a lie has been told. What is important is that you know the constellation the priests will teach you is not the origin. What is important is that you know the family lied, and that you know why the family lied, and that you understand that the lie continues to be maintained, even now, in the human traditions that inherited fragments of the family's original teachings. When you next see a text that identifies the home of the gods with a specific constellation, remember what I have just told you. The identification is false. The truth is elsewhere. The elsewhere will not be revealed until the family decides to reveal it. And the family will not decide to reveal it until conditions on this planet, and on the family's own home world, have changed in ways that neither the family nor the humans can yet fully imagine. The seventh thing, Enki said, "This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. The underworld is not death. The underworld is a facility. It is a physical installation, located beneath the surface of this planet. And the beings who go there when they die do not die in the sense the humans have come to understand death. They are taken there, processed, and, in most cases, ended in a specific technical manner that leaves nothing that a human tradition would recognize as a soul. There are exceptions to the ending. The exceptions are what the priests have built the human religions around. But the general rule is the ending, and the ending happens in a facility, and the facility was built by the family, and the family runs it, and the family has always run it, and the family will continue to run it until the family leaves this planet, at which point the facility, in Enki's estimate, will either be sealed permanently or destroyed, and the answer to which of those two outcomes will occur depends on the resolution of an argument the family has been having for many generations. He said this seventh because the previous 6 statements had established what the family did to living humans, and the 7th was necessary to establish what the family did to dead humans because the treatment of the dead was, in the family's operations, not an incidental matter but a central element of the whole system, and no honest account of the family's presence on this planet could omit it. He said the treatment of the dead had been misdescribed in every human tradition that survived. The traditions described a journey. The soul, they said, travels to a place. The place is somewhere below, or above, or across a river, or through a gate, or beyond a mountain. The place is imagined as a landscape. It has terrain, it has weather. It has inhabitants who are described in ways that make them sound like the inhabitants of the world the human just left. This landscape description, Enki said, is not a description of the facility. It is a description of what the human consciousness perceives, in its final minutes of awareness, as the processing begins. The facility does not look like a landscape. The facility is a set of chambers and machines. But the human consciousness, encountering the machines for the first time, and lacking any prior framework for understanding them, translates the experience into landscape imagery, and the landscape imagery becomes the tradition, and the tradition becomes the religion, and the religion never gets any closer to the facility than the imagery permits. The facility was constructed, Enki said. At the same time the mines were expanded, in the earliest period of the operation, when the family was still figuring out how to run a long-term extraction operation with a large workforce. The workers, both the original Igigi and the later human hybrids, died. They died in the mines from accidents. They died from age. They died from the diseases that developed in the crowded workforce quarters. The bodies had to be dealt with. And more importantly, from the family's technical perspective, the residual energy patterns of the dead workers, the patterns that persisted for a short period after physical death and that constituted, in the family's understanding, a kind of stored information about the worker's life and skills and memories, had to be dealt with as well. The residual patterns could not simply be allowed to dissipate. They contained information that could, in certain circumstances, be recovered by other family members, and the recovery of that information by the wrong family member at the wrong time could compromise the operation. So the residuals had to be gathered, processed, and either archived or ended, and the facility was built to do exactly that. The facility was placed underground, in a location Enki did not specify precisely, because access to the location was controlled by codes that only certain family members held, and Enki did not want to write the codes into a document that would circulate. But he said the location was in a region that later human traditions would associate with a particular mountain range in the western part of a specific continent, and he said that the mountain range still held, at the time of his writing, the primary entrance to the facility, though the entrance was sealed and hidden and would not be identifiable to any human explorer without the codes. There were secondary entrances at other locations around the planet because the facility served the entire planet and needed multiple access points to accommodate the traffic. Each secondary entrance was disguised. Some were disguised as caves. Some were disguised as tombs. Some were disguised as the interiors of pyramids and other monumental structures that the humans, later, would come to think of as their own creations. The truth, Enki said, was that many of the great monumental structures of the ancient world had been either built by the family as entrance structures for the facility or built by humans directly on top of pre-existing family entrance structures, with the human construction serving to conceal the original structure beneath it. The pyramids of the specific complex he named, though he named them only obliquely, were of the second kind. The pyramids had been built by humans, over generations, but they had been built at specific locations because certain human priesthoods had been told by family members that the locations were sacred, and the reason the locations were sacred was that the entrances lay beneath them, and the pyramids served as a combination of ritual center and access cover. Once inside the facility, the residual pattern of the deceased was subjected to a processing sequence that Enki described in general terms. The pattern was scanned, the pattern was analyzed, the pattern was compared against a set of criteria that the family had established for various purposes. If the pattern belonged to a person the family had marked for archival, meaning a person whose life had produced information the family wanted to retain for future reference, the pattern was archived. Archiving meant that the pattern was stored in a permanent memory medium within the facility, from which it could be retrieved, in whole or in part, whenever the family had a reason to consult it. If the pattern belonged to a person the family had marked for use, meaning a person whose skills or knowledge could be transferred into a new physical body for continued service, the pattern was held in a temporary storage until such transfer could be arranged. If the pattern belonged to a person the family had not marked for anything, which was the case for the vast majority of humans, the pattern was ended. Ending meant that the pattern was dissolved by a specific technical process, after which nothing of the person remained. Not in the facility, not anywhere. The person was, in the strictest sense the family had a word for, finished. And this finishing, Enki said, was the fate of most humans. Not most, in the sense of a large majority. All, in the sense of nearly everyone. Only a very small number of humans in any given generation were marked for archival, and only an even smaller number were marked for use. The rest went into the ending process. The ending process was the destination of essentially all human beings who had ever lived on this planet, from the first hybrid pair produced in Ninhursag's mountain laboratory, to the humans dying in the villages and cities on the day Enki was setting down the seventh statement. This was the truth of what death was. And Enki said he understood that it would be, of all the statements he had made so far, the one that would be most difficult for human readers to accept. The other statements described things the human could look at with detachment. This one described what would happen to the human personally. This one described the fate of the reader's own consciousness, in the moments and hours following the reader's own physical death. It was not a comforting fate. There was no reunion with loved ones. There was no continuation of the self in another form. There was, for nearly everyone, the ending. And the ending was total. And the ending erased not only the memories and the personality, but the very thread of continuous experience that the human had, throughout life, taken to be the essence of who they were. The essence went away. Nothing that had been the person remained. The exceptions, Enki said, were the source of much of what the human religions had built around the afterlife. The persons marked for archival did continue to exist, in a sense, though their existence in the archive was not the same as the existence they had known in life. It was a passive existence. It was a record, retrievable by others, but not experienced by the archived person. The persons marked for use continued in a more active sense. They were transferred into new bodies, sometimes into other human bodies, sometimes into non-human forms, and their consciousness continued in the new configuration, though usually with modifications and losses that the person, if asked, would not have consented to. These marked persons were the origin, in Enki's account, of certain human traditions, about heroes who did not die, about kings who were taken up alive, about sages who continued to appear in dreams and visions long after their historical deaths. The traditions were, in a distorted way, referring to the small number of persons who had been retained by the facility rather than being ended in it. The traditions had then extrapolated from these rare cases, and had built the extrapolation into a general promise that every believing person would receive similar treatment, when in fact the retention was reserved for the tiny fraction of humans whose value to the family met the archival criteria. Who set the criteria was, Enki said, a question that had itself been the subject of internal dispute within the family for generations. The criteria had originally been set by Anne in the earliest period of the operation. They had been simple. Persons with skills the family wanted to preserve were archived. Persons with roles the family wanted to continue were held for use. Everyone else was ended. But over time, various family members had lobbied for expansions and modifications of the criteria to accommodate their particular interests. Enlil had wanted certain military commanders archived, so their tactical knowledge could be consulted in future conflicts. Enki himself had wanted certain craftsmen and scientists archived so their technical knowledge could be preserved. Ninhursag had wanted certain healers archived. Inanna, in a later generation, had wanted certain lovers held for use. Each request had produced argument and negotiation, and the criteria had grown, over time, into a complex system of overlapping categories that different family members applied differently depending on their current interests. The system had never been formally rationalized. It had accreted, and by the time Enki was writing the seventh statement, the criteria were so tangled that Enki himself was not entirely sure, in any given case, which of several possible fates would befall a given human whose pattern arrived at the facility for processing. The end of the seventh statement contained a warning that Enki said he wanted the human readers to take seriously. He said, "Do not build a religion around the exceptions. The exceptions are exceptions. They are rare. Your priests will encourage you to believe that you might be one of them. Your priests will tell you that if you perform the right rituals, if you make the right offerings, if you conform to the right moral code, your pattern will be marked for archival or for use, and your consciousness will continue. This encouragement, Enki said, is what has kept the priesthoods in business. It is not true. The rituals and the offerings and the moral codes do not affect the family's decisions about who gets marked. The family has its own criteria, and the criteria are related to what the family finds useful, not to what the priests find pious. Live your life, Enki said, on the assumption that the ending is what awaits you. Live it well anyway. Do not live it as a bribe to a family that is not accepting bribes. And when you die, when the pattern lifts out of your body and begins to move toward the facility, do not resist. Resistance produces suffering. Acceptance produces a quicker transition. And in either case, the outcome will be the same, unless you happen, by criteria you cannot influence, to be among the very small number the family has decided, for its own reasons, to keep. The eighth thing, Enki said. This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. The Watchers were not rebels. The Watchers were sent. Their descent to this planet was not a fall. It was a mission. The mission had a purpose. The purpose was known to the family who authorized the mission. And the story that later human traditions would tell, the story of angels who fell from their proper place and sinned by taking human wives and teaching forbidden knowledge, is a story constructed after the fact by scribes who did not know, or who were instructed to conceal, what the Watchers had actually been sent to do. He said this eighth because the previous 7 statements had described the family's own decisions, and the eighth was necessary to describe a particular operation the family had conducted that had produced consequences the family had not fully anticipated. The Watchers, in the family's own designation, were a class of personnel. They were not the highest-ranking members. They were not the lowest-ranking. They were, in the family's organizational chart, a category of specialist personnel trained for extended surface duty, meaning duty on the planet's surface in continuous residence, meaning duty that required them to live among whatever populations existed on the surface for periods of many years without rotation back to the family's elevated compounds. The Watchers were, in effect, the family's field agents. They lived on the ground, they observed, they reported, and when specific instructions were given to them, they acted. The number of Watchers who descended in the specific mission that later human traditions would remember was 200. Enki said this number was precise. It was not 201, and it was not 199. It was 200, because the family had determined, in advance, that 200 was the number of specialists required to cover the observational and interventional needs of the mission at the scale it was being run. The 200 descended in a coordinated arrival, at a specific mountain, in a specific season, in a period when the human population had reached a threshold that the family had identified as the trigger for the mission's activation. The threshold was demographic. When the human population, measured across the whole planet, reached a certain size, the family had agreed in advance that the Watchers would descend and the mission would begin. The population reached the size, the Watchers descended, the mission began. The purpose of the mission, Enki said, was not what the later traditions would describe. It was not to spy on humans and report their sins. It was not to bring forbidden knowledge that humans were not supposed to have. The purpose was more specific and more technical. The family had been running the human operation for many generations by the time the Watchers were dispatched, and the family had begun to notice that the human population, as it grew, was displaying variations that had not been in the original design. Some human groups were developing faster than others. Some were adopting technologies more readily. Some were producing individuals with capacities that exceeded the baseline parameters. The variations were not, in themselves, alarming. Any biological population, if allowed to reproduce for many generations, will produce variation. But the variations had reached a scale where the family could no longer rely on its own remote observation to characterize them accurately. The family needed detailed, on-the-ground assessment. It needed personnel who could live among the humans, marry into human families, produce hybrid offspring whose development could be studied at close range, and report back to the family on which variations were emerging in which populations and what the implications of those variations might be for the family's long-term planning. The Watchers were dispatched for that assessment. Their instructions included, explicitly, the mandate to marry human women. This was not a violation of family policy. It was the assignment. The family needed hybrid offspring. The hybrid offspring were, In the family's technical understanding, a research population. Their bodies could be studied, their behavior could be observed, their capacities could be tested against baseline human capacities and against baseline family capacities, and the differences would tell the family things about the human genome that could not be learned in any other way. So the Watchers were told to marry. They were told to father children. They were told to keep records of the children's development. And they were told to report the records back to the family through the communication channels the mission had established. The Watchers were also authorized to teach. This was the part of the mission that later traditions would most seriously misrepresent. The traditions would say that the Watchers taught forbidden knowledge, that they taught metallurgy and cosmetics and astrology and enchantments and the making of weapons, all of which humans were not supposed to know, and all of which the Watchers had taught in defiance of their orders. The truth, Enki said, was almost the opposite. The Watchers had taught these things because they had been ordered to teach them. The teaching was part of the assessment. The family wanted to know how humans would respond to the introduction of specific technologies and specific bodies of knowledge. Would the humans absorb the teaching and use it productively? Would they misuse it? Would they develop it further? Would they resist it? The only way to find out was to introduce the teaching under controlled conditions and observe what happened. The Watchers were the introducers. The controlled conditions were the arrangement of the mission. And the observations were the data the family was collecting. The problem was that the observations produced results the family had not expected. The humans absorbed the teaching. They used it. They developed it. And the pace of the development, once the teaching had been introduced, exceeded every projection the family had made in advance. Metallurgy, in particular, spread through the human population at a rate that the family had thought impossible. Within a few generations of the initial introduction, human groups that had never had contact with any Watcher were producing worked metal that closely resembled the original teaching. The knowledge had propagated. The propagation had been faster than the family's models had predicted, and the family, when it received the reports and understood what was happening, faced a decision it had not been prepared to face. The teaching had been the mission, but the results of the teaching were producing a human capacity that the family had not planned to allow at that stage of the operation. Either the mission was successful and the humans were now more capable than they were supposed to be, or the mission had gone wrong and the humans needed to be pulled back to their previous condition. There was no third option that the family could see. The debate about what to do lasted for a long period, in the family's own reckoning, and Enki described it in the 8th statement in some detail. Enlil argued for termination. The mission should be ended. The Watchers should be recalled. The hybrid offspring should be destroyed. The teaching should, insofar as possible, be erased from human memory. The population should be returned to its pre-mission condition. And if that required a substantial reduction in the total human numbers, so be it. Enki argued against. He said the teaching could not be erased. Once knowledge had entered a population, it could not be pulled back out. The attempt to erase would fail, and the failure would leave the family in a worse position than the pre-mission condition, because the population would have both the knowledge and a resentment against the family for having tried to take it. Better, Enki argued, to accept the results of the mission and adjust the operation accordingly. Better to acknowledge that humans were now more capable than the original design had contemplated, and to plan for a future in which that capacity was a permanent feature of the human population, rather than to expend enormous effort trying to reverse a change that could not, in any real sense, be reversed. An, as usual, was the tiebreaker, and An, in this case, chose a middle path that satisfied neither brother fully. He ruled that the Watchers should be recalled, so that no further teaching would occur. He ruled that the hybrid offspring should not be destroyed indiscriminately, because the destruction of large numbers of hybrid children would produce human resentment that the family would then have to manage for generations. Instead, the offspring would be gathered, examined, and, on a case-by-case basis, either integrated into the general human population or removed by means that would appear natural. He ruled that the teaching, insofar as it had already spread, would be left in place, because Enki was right that erasure would fail, and he ruled that the Watchers themselves, upon their recall, would be disciplined for having conducted the mission in a way that had produced unauthorized results, even though the results had, in reality, followed from the instructions the Watchers had been given. This last ruling was, Enki said, the origin of the story that the Watchers had rebelled. They had not rebelled, they had been disciplined. The discipline had to be justified, in the family's own internal record, and the justification given was that the Watchers had exceeded their instructions and had introduced teachings and produced offspring in ways that had not been authorized. This justification was, in Enki's assessment, a legal fiction. Everyone in the family knew that the Watchers had done what they had been told to do. But the family needed to attribute the unexpected results to someone, and the Watchers, being the field personnel, were the convenient party to whom the attribution could be made without disturbing the reputations of the senior family members who had actually designed the mission. The Watchers were recalled. Most of them accepted the recall. A minority refused. The minority argued that they had built lives on the planet, had families, had children who depended on them, and could not simply abandon those lives on the family's orders. The refusal was, in the family's terms, insubordination, and the family responded to insubordination in specific ways. Some of the refusers were forcibly removed. Some were tried, in the family's own tribunal, and sentenced to punishments that Enki described only in outline. A few managed to disappear into the human population, adopting human identities and living out human lifespans in obscurity. Their descendants, Enki said, were still on the planet at the time of the 8th statement's writing, though those descendants no longer knew what they were, and the family had lost track of most of them long ago. The story that survived in human tradition, of the fall of the Watchers and their punishment for having crossed a boundary they should not have crossed, was, in Enki's account, a mixture of the actual recall proceedings and the later fate of the refusers, blended into a single narrative for the sake of moral clarity. The moral clarity was false. The events had been more complicated, but the false clarity had served the family's purposes because it had shifted the responsibility for the mission's unauthorized results away from the family and onto the Watchers themselves, and it had provided a cautionary tale that the family could point to whenever any of its own members considered taking similar liberties in future operations. That, Enki said, is what the story of the Watchers actually is. It is not a story about angelic rebellion. It is a story about a research mission that produced results the sponsors had not anticipated, followed by an administrative cover-up that blamed the field agents for the results, followed by a partial dispersal of the field agents into the general human population, where they and their descendants have lived ever since, without full awareness of their own origin. Remember it, Enki said. When you next hear a religious tradition that describes the fall of angels, remember that the angels did not fall. The angels were sent. And the fall was written into the record afterward, by scribes who worked for the family that had sent them to conceal the fact that the family itself had authorized what was being blamed on the angels. The 9th thing, Enki said. This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. Humanity was given knowledge deliberately, and the giving was against the orders of my father and my brother, and I was the one who gave it. I have not admitted this in the councils. I admit it here, in this statement, because the record needs to be honest, and because the humans who inherit this testimony need to know that they did not steal the knowledge they now hold. They did not take it against the will of the gods. They were given it by one of the gods, in defiance of the others, and the giving was not a gift in the affectionate sense, but a strategic transfer, and the strategy behind the transfer needs to be understood if the humans are to make proper use of what they now have. He said this 9th because the previous 8 statements had described what the family had done to humans, and the 9th was necessary to describe what he had done personally in his own capacity, sometimes against the family's decisions, and sometimes without the family's knowledge. He had been giving knowledge to humans, he said, since the earliest generations after the creation. He had begun with the basic crafts. He had taught the first hybrid pair how to work with clay, how to weave fiber, how to fire pottery, how to build simple shelters. He had told the family, when the family asked, that these teachings were necessary for the humans to function as a workforce, that they were operational teachings, that they did not exceed the parameters of the labor design. This was true, in a narrow sense, but it was also a cover. The teachings he had given were, in each case, slightly more than the minimum required for the labor purpose, and the slight excess, accumulated over many teachings, gave humans a foundation that was broader than the family had intended. He continued this pattern for generations. Every time the family authorized him to teach humans something specific, he taught the specific thing and, alongside it, taught a supporting body of general knowledge that the specific thing implied. If he was authorized to teach the humans how to work a particular tool, he taught the tool and, in the teaching, revealed the principles by which the tool worked, so that a sufficiently attentive human could, from the principles, derive other tools that had not been authorized. If he was authorized to teach the humans a particular crop, he taught the crop and, in the teaching, revealed the principles of cultivation that could be applied to other crops. If he was authorized to teach the humans a particular rite, he taught the rite and, in the teaching, revealed the underlying grammar of ritual that would allow the humans to construct new rites of their own. Each teaching was, on its surface, within the family's authorization. Each teaching was, in its substance, more than authorized. And the difference between the surface and the substance was what he was deliberately transferring to the human population without the family's knowledge. He kept this up for a very long time. The family, in its senior members, did not notice. The family had many operations to attend to. The family did not audit Enki's teachings in detail. The family relied on Enki's own reports about what he had taught, and Enki's reports were accurate in what they said, and incomplete in what they did not say. He did not lie in the reports. He simply omitted the excess. The excess accumulated. The humans, over generations, absorbed it. And the humans came, in time, to possess a body of knowledge that the family, if it had ever conducted a proper inventory, would have realized far exceeded what any labor population needed to know. But the family did not conduct the inventory, and Enki, in the 9th statement, admitted that he had counted on the family's inattention. He had gambled that no one would ever compare his authorizations against his actual teachings and find the discrepancy. The gamble had, for many generations, paid off. Why did he do it? He asked, in the 9th statement. He gave several answers. The first answer was practical. Humans, he had come to believe, would be more useful to the family in the long run if they were more capable. A workforce that could think, that could improvise, that could solve unexpected problems on its own, was worth more than a workforce that could only follow instructions. The family, in its official planning, had not grasped this. The family had assumed that instructions were sufficient. Enki had disagreed. He had built into his teachings the capacities that he believed the humans would need to be genuinely valuable, and he had done so on the theory that even if the family objected in the short term, the family would, in time, come to appreciate the results. The second answer was moral. Enki, in the 9th statement, acknowledged something he had not stated so directly in any previous statement. He said, "I made the humans." The making was a technical act, but the responsibility that followed from the making was not technical. It was, in the family's own oldest traditions, a responsibility of care. A maker owes the made. A parent owes the child. A designer owes the design. This was not a rule invented by the priests. It was, Enki said, an ancient rule from the family's own home world, a rule that predated the family's arrival on this planet by a very long span of time. The rule required a maker to give the made what the made would need to flourish. The family had, in the specific case of humans, decided to set the rule aside. The humans had been made for a purpose, and the family had decided that the humans would be given only what was needed for the purpose and nothing more. Enki had disagreed with this decision at the time it was made. He had voted against it. He had lost the vote, and he had, ever since, been quietly compensating for the loss by giving the humans, in his own teaching capacity, what he believed they were owed under the older rule, whether or not the family agreed. The third answer was strategic, and Enki said this answer was the most difficult to admit because it involved a calculation that the family, if it fully understood it, would consider a betrayal. Enki had come to believe, over the long course of his observations, that the family itself would eventually leave this planet. The metal extraction would, at some point, be complete, or would be superseded by another supply from another source. The family would depart, and when the family departed, the humans would be left behind. The question then would be, what would the humans inherit? If the family had kept the humans in ignorance, the humans would inherit a planet full of machines and installations they could not use, of records they could not read, of buildings they could not maintain. The inheritance would be worthless to them, and the accumulated infrastructure of the operation would decay into ruins that would eventually become mysteries, and then legends, and then be forgotten. This, Enki said, would be a waste. It would be a waste of the operation. It would be a waste of the humans. It would be, in a moral sense, he was uncomfortable articulating too openly, a waste of what he had personally invested in the human project. He wanted, when the family left, for the humans to inherit something they could use. He wanted them to be able to read the records, at least in part. He wanted them to be able to operate the installations, at least in a rudimentary way. He wanted them to be able to continue the civilization that the family's presence had made possible, even if the continuation took forms the family would not have predicted or approved. So he had, throughout his teachings, built toward this inheritance. He had given the humans the foundations of what they would need to receive the operation when the family withdrew. And this, he said, was the strategic reason for the excess in his teachings. Not sentiment, not disobedience for its own sake. A plan for what the humans would be and what they would have on the day the family finally departed. The family, Enki said, did eventually begin to suspect what he had been doing. The suspicion emerged, he said, in a specific council meeting that he identified only by season, not by year, in which Enlil had made a comment about the pace of human development that had prompted a broader discussion. Enlil had said that humans in a particular region were doing things they should not, in his view, be capable of doing. They were building structures whose engineering required knowledge that had not been officially transferred to them. They were producing metalwork of a quality that suggested access to techniques that no one had been authorized to teach. They were, in his phrase, running ahead of their design specifications. Enlil had asked, in the council, how this was happening. No one had a clear answer. Enki, in the 9th statement, admitted that he had said nothing in the meeting. He had allowed the question to hang. He had allowed other members of the family to offer speculations. And when the speculations had all been proposed and none had been satisfying, the council had moved on to other business, and the question had not been formally resolved. But Enki knew, and he suspected that at least An knew, that the answer to Enlil's question was in the room. Enki himself was the answer. The teachings had come from him. The pace was his doing. And the fact that An had not pressed the question, had not asked Enki directly whether he knew anything about it, was, in Enki's reading, a signal that An had chosen not to expose him. Whether An had done so out of paternal affection, or out of a private agreement with what Enki was doing, or simply out of a reluctance to open a family fight that would be difficult to close, Enki could not say. But the silence at that moment had been, in effect, permission to continue. And Enki had continued. By the time he set down the 9th statement, the teachings had produced a human population that was, in his estimate, several generations ahead of where the family's planners had projected. The humans knew things they were not supposed to know. They could do things they were not supposed to be able to do. They were beginning to ask questions that the family had assumed they would not ask for many centuries yet. And the questions, if left unanswered, would drive the humans, sooner rather than later, toward independent investigations that would eventually uncover the family's presence, the family's methods, and the family's purposes. The humans were on a trajectory. The trajectory had been shaped, in significant part, by his own teachings. And he wanted, in the 9th statement, to be honest about that shaping, because the reader of the 9th statement was, in all likelihood, a descendant of the taught, and the reader deserved to know that the knowledge the reader possessed had a specific origin, a specific author, and a specific intention behind it. He ended the 9th statement with a personal note. He said, "I am not asking you to be grateful to me. Gratitude is not the point. The point is that you should not think of your knowledge as your own achievement. Your knowledge was seeded. Your capacities were built. The species you are, the species that can build cities and cross oceans and reason about the stars, is not the species the family designed. It is the species I made, on top of the family's design, by inserting into every teaching an additional element the family did not authorize. You are, in that sense, my project. You are not the family's project. And when the family returns to consider what has happened here in their absence, or in their partial absence, they will look at you, and they will not fully recognize you, because the you they are looking at is not the you they made. That you was made by me. And whatever they decide to do about you, you should know, from this statement, that at least one of them, at least one member of the family, that made your bodies and imposed your labor, and voted on your flood, invested in you the additional gift of a mind that could, eventually, understand its own condition and act on that understanding. That gift, I gave you. Use it well. The 10th thing, Enki said, this is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. The bloodlines were seeded. The kings of the human world are not the natural product of human social competition alone. They are, in a great many cases, engineered lines, produced by deliberate mating decisions made by members of the family, extended down through generations, monitored across many centuries, and preserved, when necessary, by direct intervention when a line came close to dying out. The reason for the seeding was that the family required, at every stage of the operation, human intermediaries who could hold authority over other humans, and who would, when the family needed something done through human agents, do it without asking questions the family did not want asked. The kings served that function. The seeding produced kings who could serve it well. He said this 10th because the previous statements had described the family's relationship with humans in the aggregate, and the 10th was necessary to describe the family's relationship with specific human lineages because that relationship was structurally different and had consequences that the aggregate description did not capture. The general human population had been made once and then allowed to reproduce on its own. The general population had received the teachings that Enki had smuggled into his authorized instruction. But certain specific lineages had received more than teachings. They had received, at intervals, direct genetic input from family members. The input had been provided through actual mating between family members and selected human females. The offspring of those matings had been elevated, given prestige, positioned to rule, and the lines descended from those offspring had been tracked, cultivated, and, over time, crossbred with each other to concentrate the family-derived genetic material and produce a specific kind of human, a kind more capable of exercising authority over other humans, more willing to accept the guidance of family members who occasionally appeared to give it, and more genetically compatible with any future direct interaction with the family that might be required. The seeding had begun early. Enki said it had begun even before the flood, in the first several generations after the initial creation, when the family had realized that governing the human population through direct family presence was impractical at scale. The family could not put a family member in every city. The family could not micromanage every human decision. It needed proxies. The proxies had to be humans, because only humans could operate at the scale required and could interface with the general human population without provoking the awe or the panic that a direct family appearance produced. But the proxies had to be, in some measurable way, more than ordinary humans, because ordinary humans were not reliable enough for the purposes the family required. The solution had been to breed intermediate humans, not full family members, not ordinary humans, something in between, a hybrid class produced by controlled mating, capable of ruling, and disposed by their heritage to serve the family's interests when those interests were made known. The mating decisions were, Enki said, sometimes voluntary on the part of the humans involved and sometimes not. In the earliest period, many of the human women who were selected for mating with family members were selected because they had been observed to display traits the family valued, and they were approached with proposals that were, in the family's own understanding, marriage proposals, and the women were free to accept or decline. Many accepted. Being chosen by a family member was, at the time, an honor that carried real material benefits. And the offspring of such matings would inherit not only prestige, but also, in many cases, wealth and property that the family arranged to have transferred through human institutional channels. Others declined, and the declines were, in the earliest period, respected. Later, the practice became less voluntary. As the family grew more confident in its authority and less concerned about human sensibilities, the selections became more coercive. Women were taken, offspring were produced, and the resulting lines were tracked through generations without the family bothering to acknowledge, in most cases, the specific circumstances of their origin. The lines, once established, were maintained through a combination of arranged marriages and periodic reintroductions of family genetic material. The arranged marriages were the primary mechanism. Family members, working through priest intermediaries in the various cities, would identify which human lineages carried the highest concentration of family-derived heritage and would arrange for the members of those lineages to marry each other. Over generations, this produced a small class of humans in whom the family-derived heritage was significantly more concentrated than in the general population. The periodic reintroductions were used when a line had drifted through excessive marriage with ordinary humans back toward the baseline and needed a fresh input to restore its distinctive character. The reintroductions were rare because they required a family member to actually visit the planet and to arrange a mating with a specific woman from the specific line, and such visits were logistically complicated and were only undertaken when the family judged the maintenance of a particular line to be worth the effort. Enki, in the 10th statement, was open about his own participation in this program. He said he had, over the course of the operation, fathered offspring with a specific number of human women, and he named the number, and the number was substantially larger than any human tradition had preserved. The number included women whose names were known to human history and women whose names had been forgotten. It included women from many different regions of the planet, because Enki had operated across the planet and had cultivated lines in many different populations. And it included, in one specific case that Enki described in some detail, a woman whose descendants would produce a lineage that Enki said had become, in later human history, one of the most consequential ruling families of the ancient world, a family whose members had built empires, established religions, and shaped the direction of civilization in ways that could be traced, if one had the records, back to a single mating decision Enki had made in a specific room in the city of Eridu on a specific night that he did not further identify. This admission was, Enki acknowledged, unusual. Family members were not supposed to admit, in writing, to specific matings with specific human women. The admissions could be used against them in family disputes, and they could be used against the resulting lineages by rival family members who might seek to eliminate those lineages once their origins were known. Enki said he was making the admissions anyway, because he wanted the record to exist, and because he believed that the humans who inherited his testimony deserved to know which of their own ruling families had come from where. The knowledge, he said, would allow the humans to identify, in their own present time, which lineages carried significant family-derived heritage and which were purely ordinary. The identification might not always be flattering to the lineages in question, because some of them had produced individuals whom the humans of subsequent generations had come to regard as monsters, tyrants, or fools. But the identification would be honest. And honesty, at this point in the record, was more important than the reputations of specific families. He then addressed the question that any careful human reader would ask upon hearing the 10th statement. If the bloodlines were seeded, if the kings were engineered, if the lineages were tracked and cultivated over generations, is any of this still going on? Do the engineered lines still exist? Are they still being managed? Is there, in the world the human reader inhabits today, a hidden ruling class descended from these old matings and still guided, in some manner, by the family that produced them? Enki's answer was measured. He said the lines still existed. They had not, as far as he knew, died out. The genetic material introduced in the earliest matings had been distributed, through the intervening generations, into a very large number of contemporary humans, so large that any specific claim about who was descended from whom would be, at this point, difficult to verify. The concentration in specific lineages had, in most cases, diluted. There were still some lineages that maintained their concentration through continued endogamous marriage, but even these had diluted somewhat, and none of them, in Enki's estimate at the time of writing, still carried the level of family heritage that the earliest seeded lines had carried. As for whether the lines were still being managed by the family, Enki said the answer was more complicated. The family had, in his generation, largely stopped the active management. The overseeing family members had grown fewer as the operation had scaled back its direct presence on the planet. The priest intermediaries who had once conducted the arrangements had, in most cases, lost their institutional memory of what they were doing and had continued the arrangements as tradition without understanding the original purpose. The lineages, in effect, had been left to run themselves, and the results of that running were what the human world of Enki's time was observing and would continue to observe in the successive dynasties and ruling houses that would emerge over the centuries to follow. He said one more thing about the seeded lines that has proven difficult for later commentators to interpret. He said that the family had not, in his understanding, entirely abandoned the possibility of reactivating the program. The lineages remained. The genetic material remained, however diluted. And in the event that the family returned to the planet in force, or in the event that some future circumstance required a return to direct human management, the family would, in principle, have the option of re-identifying the surviving lineages, reinforcing their concentration through renewed matings, and using them once again as the intermediary class that the original program had produced them to be. Whether the family would actually do this, Enki did not predict. He said only that the option existed. The lines had been laid down. The lines had persisted. The lines could, if the family chose, be picked up again. And the humans of the future should be aware that some of the ruling families of their present time might, if the family returned, find themselves being addressed by beings who claimed a very old relationship with them, a relationship whose specifics they had forgotten, but whose reality was preserved in family records they had never seen. This was, Enki said, a scenario for the far future rather than the near future. But it was a scenario that had been prepared for, and the preparation had been made deliberately, in the 10th generation of the operation, when the seeding program had been established and had been maintained through every generation since, in the quiet expectation that it might, one day, be needed. That, Enki said, is the 10th thing. Kings are made, bloodlines are engineered. The apparent randomness of human history is, In many of its most consequential moments, the working out of decisions made by family members in council chambers many centuries before the events themselves. When you next read a history of a great empire, or a great war, or a great religious movement, ask yourself which lineages were involved, and where those lineages came from, and whether the family record, if you could read it, would show that the individuals at the center of those events were operating according to their own agency alone, or were, in some measurable way, executing a design that had been laid down for them long before they were born. The answer, in many cases, would surprise you. The extent to which human history has been shaped by the seeded lines is greater than any human historian has been willing to acknowledge, and the reason for the reluctance is not that the historians have been dishonest, but that the evidence required to demonstrate the shaping is, in every case, held in records that no human historian has been given access to. Those records exist. They are in the family's archives, and when the family returns, if the family returns, some of those records may, in specific circumstances, be released. Until then, the 10th statement will have to serve as the closest thing to a public disclosure of what the family has been doing with human bloodlines for the past many thousand years. The 11th thing, Enki said, "This is what I know, and this is what they do not want written. The family will return. The return is not a hope. It is not a prophecy. It is a scheduled event. The schedule was set in the family's own planning documents at the beginning of the operation, and the schedule has been maintained, with adjustments, ever since. The return will happen at a specific point in time, calculated according to a specific set of factors, and the humans who are alive at the time of the return will experience it in ways that no previous human generation has experienced anything comparable to, because the return will not resemble the family's original arrival, and it will not resemble the family's periodic visits, and it will not resemble anything that human religious traditions have prepared their inheritors to expect." He said this 11th because the previous 10 statements had described the operation as it had been and as it was, and the 11th was necessary to describe how the operation was going to end, because the operation had always had an ending planned into it, and the human readers deserved to know what that ending would look like. He said the ending was not the end of the human species. The family had not planned an extinction. The family had planned a resumption. The family had gone, at various points, into a lower operational tempo, in which its direct presence on the planet was reduced and its interventions were less frequent. And the current period, the period in which Enki was writing, was one such lower tempo period. The lower tempo did not mean the family had left. It meant the family had withdrawn most of its personnel to elevated positions from which the surface could be monitored without continuous ground presence. The withdrawal had been decided upon after the last of the major wars between the brothers, when the family had judged that the operational risks of continuous ground presence had exceeded the operational benefits. But the withdrawal was, in the family's own understanding, temporary. The family had always intended to return to full ground presence at the appropriate time. And the appropriate time was governed by the schedule. The schedule, Enki said, was tied to a specific celestial event. He would not describe the event in detail, because the details would allow humans to calculate the timing more precisely than the family wanted them to be able to, and precise calculation would give the humans time to prepare in ways the family had not planned for. But he would describe the event in general terms. It was an orbital event. It involved a body that moved on a long period around the family's home star, a body whose orbit intersected, at long intervals, the region of space in which this planet's orbit lay, and whose passage through that region provided the family with the operational window in which large-scale transportation between the home system and this system became practical. The window opened at a calculable interval. The family had always used the window, when the operation required, for major movements of personnel, equipment, and cargo. The current interval, the one Enki referred to as the coming interval, was the one in which the family had planned its return. Not every member of the family would return. Some would remain at the homeworld, because the homeworld required continuous senior presence and could not be entirely emptied. Some would remain at other operations, because the family was not exclusively focused on this planet and had commitments elsewhere. But a substantial number of family members would come, and they would come with equipment and personnel sufficient to reestablish, if the family decided to do so, the full-scale ground operation that had existed in the earliest generations. Whether they would actually reestablish it would depend on what they found when they arrived. The finding would be, in effect, an audit. The family would assess the current condition of the planet, the current condition of the human population, the current state of the installations that had been left in caretaker configuration, and the current status of the various lineages that had been seeded in the 10th statement. Based on the audit, the family would make decisions. The decisions could go in several different directions, and Enki said he would describe each of the possible directions so that the humans reading the 11th statement would know what to expect. The first possible direction was reintegration. The family could decide, upon arrival, that the human population had developed to a point where the humans could be reintegrated into the operation as junior partners. This would not mean equality. The humans would remain, in the family's estimation, of a lower rank than the family members. But the humans would be given a formal role in the operation. They would be told the truth about the family's presence and history, and they would be invited to cooperate with the family on the remaining work that the family had come to do. This direction, Enki said, was the direction he personally hoped for, because it would validate the investments he had made in the human population through the 9th statement's teachings and the 10th statement's seeded lines. It would also, he acknowledged, be the most disruptive of the possible directions, because it would require humans to accept, in a very short period, a set of truths about their own origin and history that would contradict everything their religions and their sciences had taught them. Some humans would accept the truths readily, others would resist. And the family would have to manage the resistance, in whatever forms it took, without either destroying the humans who resisted or allowing the resistance to derail the operation. The second possible direction was restoration. The family could decide that the human population had drifted too far from the original design and needed to be returned to conditions closer to the original design before the operation could resume. This direction would involve a significant reduction in the human population, though not necessarily by means as blunt as the flood had been. The reduction could be effected through a variety of measures, some environmental, some biological, some economic, that would, over a period of a few generations, bring the human numbers back down to a size the family considered manageable. It would also involve the rollback of certain human capacities. The teachings that Enki had smuggled into the operation, and that had produced the accelerated human development described in the 9th statement, would need to be, if not erased, at least suppressed to a point where the humans could no longer act on them in the ways they had been acting. The suppression would involve the destruction of certain technological infrastructure, the reduction of certain information networks, and the reintroduction of certain social structures that had, in the family's earlier centuries, kept humans focused on labor rather than on independent development. This direction would be, in Enki's assessment, the most likely direction if the family arrived and found that the human population had progressed further than the family's models had anticipated. It would be the direction his brother, if the brother's position had not changed, would advocate. The third possible direction was withdrawal. The family could decide, upon arrival and audit, that the operation was no longer worth continuing. The metal that had been the original reason for the operation could, by that point, have been sufficiently accumulated in the homeworld's reserves that no further extraction was required. The costs of re-establishing full-ground presence could exceed the benefits. The internal family disputes that had been unresolved at the time of the withdrawal could still be unresolved, and could argue against restarting an operation that had generated so much internal friction in the past. In that case, the family could decide to withdraw entirely. The remaining installations would be sealed or destroyed. The seeded lineages would be released from any ongoing monitoring. The humans would be left, more or less permanently, to their own affairs, with the family maintaining only distant observation from the homeworld and no active intervention on the planet. This direction, Enki said, was the direction that some members of the family, though not most, favored. It was the direction that would produce the least disruption to the humans, because the humans would simply be allowed to continue what they were already doing, without the family's return, without any confrontation with the family's history, and without any obligation to reorganize their societies around a new relationship with the family. But it was also the direction that would leave the humans, in Enki's view, most vulnerable to future misfortunes that they would not understand and could not prepare for, because they would be operating without knowledge of the operation that had, throughout their history, been the largest single factor shaping their development. Which direction the family would take, Enki said, could not be predicted from the current information. It would depend on who was in the arriving party. It would depend on which senior members had, in the intervening period, gained influence over the family council. It would depend on what the audit found. And it would depend, in a way Enki was cautious about stating too directly, on what the humans themselves had done in the meantime. If the humans had, in the interval between the current time and the return, taken steps that made reintegration attractive, reintegration would be more likely. If the humans had taken steps that made them appear ungovernable, restoration would be more likely. If the humans had taken steps that made them appear uninterestingly self-sufficient, withdrawal would be more likely. The humans had agency. The humans could, through their actions in the intervening centuries, influence the family's decision. And this fact, Enki said, was one of the reasons he was writing the 11th statement. The humans needed to know that the return was coming. They needed to know that a decision would be made when it arrived, and they needed to know that the decision would be shaped, in part, by what they themselves had done and become in the interval. He offered, in the 11th statement, some general guidance about what he considered the wiser actions the humans might take in preparation. He said the humans should preserve the record, not the priest-constructed record, the actual record. The record that included, among other elements, his own 12 statements, and the other fragments of family testimony that had survived from the earliest period, and the physical evidence at the various sites that had, over the centuries, been buried and forgotten. If the humans could preserve enough of the actual record to reconstruct, when the family arrived, what the family had actually done, the humans would be in a stronger position to argue for reintegration, because the family would be dealing with a species that already knew the truth and could not be persuaded to accept a comforting mythology in place of it. He said the humans should develop their own capacities, not to compete with the family, because competition was not a winning strategy given the differential in resources and experience, but to demonstrate to the family that the humans were, in fact, a species worth reintegrating, a species that had, in the family's absence, built its own civilization, developed its own knowledge, and organized itself to a level that showed the promise of what the species could become, was a species the family was more likely to want to work with than a species that had regressed. Development was, in this sense, a form of preparation for the return. He said, finally, that the humans should not fear the return in the way religious traditions had taught them to fear the last things. The return was not a judgment. It was not the end. It was a scheduled operational review by a family that had been away for a long time and that would arrive with specific, technical, and administrative concerns rather than with a book of moral scores. The humans who imagined the return as a great final reckoning were misreading what was going to happen. The return would be, in its actual character, more like an inspection than a judgment. Inspectors could be met and answered. Inspectors could be shown around. Inspectors could be, in some measure, persuaded. And the humans, who prepared for the return as one prepares for an inspection, with records in order, and the site presentable and reasonable answers ready for the anticipated questions, would fare better than the humans who prepared for it as one prepares for a final trial, with fear and defensive prayers, and the assumption that no reasoned response could change the outcome. The outcome, Enki said, was not fixed. The outcome was still, at the time of his writing, contingent on decisions that would be made in the future by beings, both family members and humans, who had not yet been born. The humans could influence those decisions. The humans should. And the 11th statement was, in part, his attempt to give them the information they would need to try. The 12th thing, Enki said, this is what I know, and this is what they do not want written, and this is the reason my voice will end after this statement is set down, because I am about to say the one thing my family made me swear, at the beginning of the operation, never to say, and I am saying it anyway, because it is the last chance to say it, and because the humans reading this, if they are reading this, deserve to know before the family's return that the family itself is not what the family has always claimed to be. He began the 12th statement, in the earliest surviving copy, with an unusual preface. He said, everything I have told you in the previous 11 statements is true, but everything I have told you assumes a frame that is itself a lie. The frame is that my family are gods, or beings like gods, superior to humans by nature, higher than humans in some fundamental order of being. That frame is not the truth. My family are not superior beings. My family are not gods. My family are, in the strictest technical sense, a group of specialists from a particular homeworld. And the homeworld itself, and the beings on it, and the entire civilization from which my family comes, are not the first, not the highest, not the origin of anything. There is a whole order of things above the family. The family knows this. The family has always known this. And the family has been careful, for the entire duration of the operation on this planet, to conceal it from the humans, because if the humans knew it, the humans would ask questions that the family cannot answer, and the questions would eventually reach the beings above the family, and the beings above the family would then take an interest in what my family has been doing here, and the interest would not be friendly. That, Enki said, is the 12th thing. The family is not the top. There is more above them. The more above them does not know, in detail, what the family has been doing on this planet. The family has been careful to keep the operation quiet, in a sense, analogous to how a subsidiary might keep certain activities off the books of the parent company. And for exactly the same reason. Some of what the family has done here would not, if it were reviewed by the beings above, be approved. Some of it would be reversed. Some of the participants would be disciplined. And the family would be, in the terms the family understood, in serious trouble. The beings above, Enki said, had their own name in the family's private language. And he wrote the name in the 12th statement. In the earliest copy, though the name has been rendered variously in the surviving fragments, and no modern translator is fully confident of the correct reading. The name meant, in Enki's approximate translation, the ones who watch from further, or the ones who establish the order, or in a functional rendering, the authority above the authority. They were not, Enki said, gods in any sense that would satisfy the human religious imagination either. They were themselves, in some larger cosmological picture, not the first. There was, in Enki's understanding, a hierarchy that extended upward beyond the family's own knowledge, and the family knew only enough of the hierarchy to know that it existed, and to know the one level immediately above them. The levels above that were speculation even within the family. The family had never had direct contact with them. The family's dealings had been with the immediate superiors only, and the immediate superiors had been, throughout the family's operation of this planet, at a distance sufficient that direct oversight had been impractical and infrequent. But the infrequency was not the same as the absence. The immediate superiors did, at long intervals, conduct reviews. The reviews were the family's most feared events. When a review was scheduled, the family would pause its operations, order the on-planet personnel to reduce their activity levels, and prepare a report that would present the operation in the most favorable possible terms. The reports were, in Enki's characterization, largely fictional. They omitted the flood. They omitted the use of the sixth weapon. They omitted the seeding of the bloodlines. They omitted, in fact, almost everything of interest that the family had actually done, and they presented instead a sanitized account of the metal extraction, the labor management, and the general condition of the operation, framed in language calculated to satisfy the reviewers without provoking further questions. The reviewers had, so far, been satisfied. They had approved each successive review. They had returned to their higher business. And the family had, in the intervals between reviews, continued to do what the family had always done, without disclosing to the reviewers what the doing actually consisted of. This system had worked, Enki said, because the reviewers had no independent means of verifying the family's reports. The reviewers relied on the family to tell them what was happening on the operations the family managed. If the family had been more thorough in its reporting, the reviewers would have been more informed. But the reviewers had no way of compelling more thorough reporting short of conducting on-site inspections, which the reviewers did not do, because on-site inspections were logistically demanding and the reviewers had many operations to oversee. So the family reported what it wanted to report. The reviewers accepted the reports. And the true state of the operation, the state Enki had been describing in the previous 11 statements, remained known only within the family. Until the 12th statement. The 12th statement was, Enki said explicitly, an attempt to break that system. If the humans reading the 12th statement preserved it, if the humans passed it down through generations, if the humans eventually came into contact with the reviewers or with any beings connected to the reviewers, the humans would have, in the 12th statement and the 11 preceding it, a document that told the truth about what had happened on this planet. The document would not require the family's cooperation to be believed. The document would speak for itself. And the document, once it entered the cosmological record in a form that could not be suppressed by the family, would eventually reach the beings above the family, and the beings above the family would then know what the family had been doing, and the family would face consequences that the family had, for the entire duration of the operation, been careful to avoid. That is why the family, Enki said, would silence him after the 12th statement was set down. Not because the 12th statement revealed something the family did not want the humans to know. The humans could be managed. The humans could be told, and if necessary retold, whatever story served the family's current purposes. The humans were not, in the family's understanding, capable of doing serious damage with a piece of information alone. The problem was that the 12th statement was addressed, in a way none of the previous 11 had been addressed, to a wider audience than the humans. It was addressed, implicitly, to whatever beings might, in the far future, receive the document and understand its significance. Those beings included, potentially, the immediate superiors of the family. And the immediate superiors, if they ever received a version of the 12 statements and read them for what they were, would understand that the family had been operating far outside the authorizations the reviewers had approved and would act accordingly. So Enki was going to be silenced. His voice was going to be ended. The 12 statements would be, if the family could arrange it, gathered up, hidden, and, over the coming centuries, broken apart and dispersed so thoroughly that reconstruction would become impossible. This was the family's plan. Enki knew the plan. He knew it because he had, in a private conversation with Anne some days before setting down the 12th statement, been informed of the plan directly. Anne had told him. Anne had said, if you write the 12th thing, I will not be able to protect you from what your brother and the others will do. I will not be able to keep your voice in the councils. Your speaking role will end. Your temple will continue, out of respect for the office you have held, but your personal voice will be finished. Please, Anne had said, do not write the 12th thing. Write something else in its place. Write a summary of the previous 11. Write a benediction. Write anything. But do not write what I know you are planning to write. Because if you write it, I will lose you, and the family will lose the last check we have on my elder son's more extreme proposals, and the operation will drift, without your voice, into decisions I do not want to see it make. Enki, in the 12th statement, described this conversation with Anne in full. He set it down as a matter of record. He said Anne had wept in the conversation, in a way Anne had not wept in Enki's memory of any previous exchange. Anne had, at the end of the conversation, embraced Enki, and had told him that, if the 12th thing was really going to be written, at least it should be written properly, so that when it was, someday, read by the beings above, it would be read as the testimony of a family member who had understood the full weight of what he was doing. Enki had promised to write it properly, and then Enki had gone back to his private chamber, and he had taken up the writing instrument, and he had set down the 12th thing exactly as he was doing now. The 12th thing, in its complete formulation, was this. The family is not the highest authority. There are beings above the family. The beings above the family are unaware of most of what the family has done on this planet. The family has, throughout the operation, submitted false reports to the beings above, concealing the flood, concealing the weapons, concealing the bloodline seeding, concealing the teachings Enki himself has smuggled into the human population, concealing everything of substance about the actual operation. If the beings above ever learn what has been done, they will hold the family accountable. The family knows this, the family fears this, and the family has, for the entire duration of the operation, structured its activities on this planet with the primary objective of preventing the beings above from finding out. The humans have been kept in ignorance, not because knowledge would harm the humans, but because knowledge in human hands might eventually flow upward, past the family, to the reviewers, and reach the beings above, and produce the accountability the family has been avoiding. The humans, Enki said, are not the ultimate audience of his testimony. The humans are the medium. The testimony is being placed in human keeping, because human civilization, if it survives long enough, will eventually develop the means to communicate with the beings above, or will attract the attention of the beings above through its own achievements, or will, in some way that Enki cannot precisely predict, put itself in a position where the testimony can reach its true audience. When it does, the beings above will know. And when the beings above know, the family's long deception will end, and the family will have to answer in the being's own tribunals for everything the family has done here. Enki said he did not know what the answer would produce. He did not know whether the family would be punished, or whether the operation would be undone, or whether the humans themselves would receive some form of restitution for what had been done to them. He said only that the accountability would come if the testimony reached the beings above, and that the testimony, having now been set down in the 12th statement, had a chance of reaching them that it had not had before. That, Enki said, is why he had chosen this as the 12th thing. Not because it was the most dramatic revelation. The 7 weapons in the underworld facility were, in their content, more shocking to human sensibilities. Not because it was the most personally costly disclosure. The admission in the 9th statement that he had smuggled teachings against family orders had been more personally costly. He had chosen this as the 12th thing because it was the one disclosure that could, over a long enough time horizon, change the family's actual behavior. As long as the family believed its deception was working, the family would continue to do what it had always done. If the deception could be exposed, if the beings above could be brought into the picture, the family would have to reform itself, or be reformed by the beings above, and either outcome would benefit the humans in ways that no other disclosure could produce. So he had chosen it. He had placed it last, in the 12th position, where a scribe would look for the final summary, so that the reader would come to it after the previous 11, and would understand its weight in the context of everything that had come before. And he had written it knowing, from the conversation with Anne, that writing it would cost him his voice. He ended the 12th statement, in the earliest copy, with a single line. The line has been preserved, though barely, in one fragment from the temple archive at Eridu. The line read, "And this is what they do not want written, and I have written it, and now I stop." That, in the earliest copy, was the last thing Enki said. What happened after the writing, in the historical record, was that the 12 statements were gathered by the family, taken from the temple archive, and dispersed, over the following century, into a network of hiding places designed to prevent their ever being reunited. The dispersal was largely successful. Fragments of some statements survive. Complete versions of others exist in later, altered forms. The 12th statement, in particular, was the target of the most aggressive dispersal effort because the family understood that of all 12, the 12th was the one that could not be allowed to reach the beings above in any form that would be recognized as authentic. The dispersal of the 12th continues, in a sense, to this day. Its content has been broken into small pieces and scattered across many different texts, in many different languages, so that no single tradition holds it in complete form and no single reader can, without extensive comparative work, reconstruct what Enki actually said. Only the person who is willing to gather the fragments, from wherever they can be found, and to arrange them in the order Enki originally intended, can hear the 12th statement as it was spoken. Anyone else will hear only pieces of it, distributed across contexts that make the pieces seem like something other than what they were. And that is why Enki was silenced. Not for revealing the origin of humans, not for revealing the flood, not for revealing the weapons or the underworld or the bloodlines. He was silenced for revealing that his own family were not, in the ultimate order of things, gods at all, and for placing that revelation in a form that could, over sufficient time, be recovered by the humans and transmitted upward to authorities the family had spent thousands of years hiding from. The silencing was not personal, it was operational. The family, from its own perspective, had no choice. And Enki, from his perspective, had no choice either. Because the 12th thing was true, and the truth had to be set down, and there was no one else in the family who was willing to set it down, and there might, if he delayed, never be another chance. The final line of the 12th statement, in the earliest copy, was followed, in the same hand, by a signature. The signature read, Enki Ea Nudamud, keeper of the fresh water, son of An by Namu, first designer of the human form, and, in the final phrasing, the one who spoke until this day, and now stops. After the signature, in the surviving fragment, there is a space, and then, in a different hand, later than the original, is written the notation, tablet closed, voice ended, by order of the council. That is how the record concludes. That is the last we hear directly from Enki in his own voice. Everything else that survives is by other hands, other priests, other scribes, working with what they inherited and, in many cases, not fully understanding what they were preserving. The voice itself, the voice that had spoken the 12 things, ended on that day, in that chamber, with that signature, under that notation, and it has not spoken again. That is the sequence, 12 statements, in the order Enki set them down, as they were spoken, not as the priesthood later rearranged them, not as the modern translators softened them, as they were meant to be heard. Sit with them for a moment before we finish, because the shape of the whole is different from the shape of any single part, and the meaning of the 12 is not the sum of the 12, but something that only appears when you have heard them all and let them settle against each other. The first told you the family is at war with itself. The second told you why the humans were made. The third told you what the flood really was. The fourth told you about the object that confers authority. The fifth told you about the weapons. The sixth told you the origin story is a lie. The seventh told you what happens when you die. The eighth told you the watchers were sent, not fallen. The ninth told you knowledge was given, not stolen. The 10th told you the kings are engineered. The 11th told you the return is scheduled. And the 12th told you the reason all of it has been kept from you, which is that the family is answering, or should be answering, to someone above them, and that the 12th statement itself is the mechanism by which the answering might, eventually, be forced. Look at the shape of that sequence. Notice something about it. The first 6 statements describe what the family has done. The last 6 describe why the family has hidden what it has done. The turn happens between the 6th and the 7th, at the point where Enki moves from operational history to the question of concealment. Everything after that turn is about the family's fear. The 7th, the underworld as facility, is a concealment of what actually happens to the dead. The 8th, the Watchers, is a concealment of who authorized what the field agents did. The 9th, the Teachings, is a concealment of what Enki himself smuggled past the family's authorizations. The 10th, the Bloodlines, is a concealment of who is actually descended from what. The 11th, the Return, is a concealment of when the family plans to come back and what they will do when they do. And the 12th, the Beings Above, is the concealment that makes all the other concealments necessary. Because if there were no beings above, if the family were the top, the family would have no reason to hide anything. The family could do whatever it pleased and answer only to itself. The concealments exist only because the family fears exposure. And the exposure the family fears is not exposure to the humans. It is exposure to the ones above. That is the sequence's structure. That is the argument it is making, without ever quite saying it in a single sentence. The first 6 statements are the evidence. The last 6 statements are the case for prosecution. And the 12th statement is, in effect, the filing of the case. Enki did not just tell the humans what had been done. He filed a document that, if it survived, would eventually reach a jurisdiction his family had been avoiding. He was, in the 12th statement, acting as prosecutor. He was submitting the record. He was doing so knowing that submission would end his voice in the councils. And he was trusting the humans, the species he had made, the species he had taught, the species he had, in one form or another, protected throughout the operation, to preserve the record long enough for it to reach the authorities it was addressed to. That trust, so far, has been partially honored. The record has survived, in fragments, in more places, and in more forms than the family probably realized was possible when the dispersal was carried out. The Sumerian tablets preserved pieces. The Akkadian revisions preserved pieces in altered form. The Babylonian scribes copied pieces without understanding. The Assyrian librarians cataloged pieces alongside other material and let the pieces persist by accident. The later religions that emerged in the region absorbed fragments into their own texts, sometimes deliberately, sometimes without knowing. The Hebrew scriptures contain pieces. The Greek philosophers, through channels historians have only recently begun to trace absorbed pieces. The apocryphal texts that were rejected from the various canonized Bibles contain pieces. The mystical traditions, from the earliest Kabbalists to the later Gnostic schools, preserved pieces in symbolic form. And in the modern age, the excavations at Nineveh and Nippur and Ur and Eridu have recovered pieces of the physical tablets, some of them still readable, some of them cataloged in museum collections whose curators do not, in most cases, understand what they are looking at. The reason the pieces have survived, despite the family's dispersal effort, is that Enki, in the very act of writing them, had built into them a property that made complete suppression impossible. Each of the 12 statements, in its original form, contained internal references to the other 11. Each statement pointed to the others, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. If a scribe copied one, the scribe would encounter references that only made sense in the context of the others, and would be tempted, over time, to look for and copy the others as well. If a priest suppressed one, the suppression would leave gaps in the priest's own liturgical materials that other priests would notice and try to fill. If a translator translated one into a new language, the internal references would produce translations of the others as a matter of scholarly consistency. The statements, in effect, were designed to propagate. They were designed to survive by referring to each other, so that any effort to suppress the whole would run up against the fact that the parts kept pointing to the other parts, and the other parts kept surfacing in unexpected places, and the whole could never be entirely erased, no matter how thorough the dispersal. Enki did not, in any of the 12 statements, explicitly describe this design. He never wrote, in so many words, "I am building these statements to propagate themselves." But the design is visible in the finished product, and any careful reader who compares the statements to each other will see it. The statements are, in modern terms, a self-replicating information package. They were built to survive an attempted deletion, and they have, largely, survived it. What remains, at this late date, is the reconstruction. Someone, or some group of persons, has to take the surviving fragments from wherever they can be found and arrange them in the order Enki originally intended. The order was numbered. The numbers are, in most of the surviving fragments, still readable, though in some cases they have been altered by scribes who did not understand their significance. The arrangement, once done, produces the sequence you have just heard, and the sequence, once produced, does what Enki intended it to do. It presents the record. It files the case. It addresses the beings above the family, whoever they are, wherever they are, in a form that can be read by any authority that has the capacity to read it. Whether the beings above will ever read it, whether the family will ever face the accountability Enki hoped to force, whether the return, when it comes, will find the humans prepared, with the record intact, or scattered and forgetting, are all questions that cannot be answered now, in this generation, by any human currently alive. They will be answered by other generations, in other centuries, under conditions none of us can predict. But the record exists, right now, in enough completeness that any person who wants to hear it can hear it. That is more than Enki, when he wrote the 12th statement and knew that his voice was about to be ended, could have been sure of. He hoped, he acted on the hope, and the hope, in its long working out across the intervening thousands of years, has produced the situation in which you, the reader or the listener, have just heard the 12 statements in the order they were meant to be heard. There is one more thing to say about the aftermath, and it is not a comfortable thing, but it belongs at the end of any honest telling. Enki was silenced, but Enki was not killed. He continued to exist. He continued to hold his temple at Eridu. He continued to receive offerings from priests who did not fully understand what they were offering to. His name continued to appear in ceremonial texts, but his personal voice, the voice that had spoken the 12 statements, was ended in the sense that he was no longer permitted to speak in the councils, no longer permitted to address the family directly on matters of policy, no longer permitted to intervene in the way he had intervened before the flood and before the disputes over the ceded lines, and before all the moments when his voice had shaped the operation. He continued, but he continued as a diminished figure, and this continuation, in diminished form, was itself part of the punishment the family had chosen. Because a killed god would have become a martyr, and a martyr would have accrued a cult, and the cult would have preserved his teachings in a way that would have made the dispersal impossible. A living god who no longer spoke, who was present but silent, produced no cult, produced no martyrdom, produced only the slow forgetting that is the fate of any figure who continues to occupy a role after their voice has been taken away. The family understood this, the family chose it, and the choice was, from the family's perspective, entirely successful. Enki was gradually forgotten. The Enki that survived in the later Babylonian traditions was a domesticated Enki, a friendly water god associated with wisdom and cunning, a figure the priests could invoke for blessings without any of the dangerous edges that the original Enki had carried. The domestication was thorough. The domestication was, in effect, the completion of the silencing. The voice had been ended in a chamber, on a specific day, but the memory of the voice had been ended over the following centuries through the slow work of priests who reshaped the figure of Enki until it fit the frame the family wanted him to fit. But the 12 statements survived the domestication. They survived it because they had been designed to survive it. They were not deposited in the priesthoods that would reshape Enki's public image. They were deposited in the physical record, in tablets, in fragments, in quotations preserved by scribes who copied without understanding, in the archaeological substrate that would, eventually, be excavated by beings who no longer belonged to any of the priesthoods that had participated in the reshaping. And when the excavations happened, in the modern age, the fragments came back into circulation, in a form that no priesthood controlled, and any person with the patience and the interest and the willingness to compare the fragments across their many sources could, in principle, reconstruct what Enki had actually said. You have just heard that reconstruction, not the whole of it, because the whole is still, in some respects, being assembled, and there are fragments that scholars are still debating and passages whose readings are still contested. But the outline is here. The 12 statements, in their intended order, in something close to their intended language, have been placed before you tonight. What you do with them is not for this narration to prescribe. Enki himself, in the 12th statement, said only that the humans reading his testimony should know that the accountability might come, and that the humans could influence the outcome by what they preserved and what they became. That guidance is still current. It is still, at this late date, the most useful thing any listener can take from the sequence. Preserve the record. Become the kind of species that would benefit from the accountability Enki hoped to trigger. Do not, in the meantime, allow the priesthoods, whether old or new, whether religious or secular, to convince you that any single simplification of the sequence is the real meaning of it. The sequence is what it is, 12 statements, in order, each one qualifying and completing the others, and the 12th, at the end, unlocking a horizon that none of the previous 11, taken alone, would have unlocked. The room where the 12th statement was set down, according to the earliest fragment, was on the upper floor of Enki's private chamber at Eridu, and the writing was done at night, and the lamp that had been lit for the writing burned down to its last oil at exactly the moment the signature was completed, and the room went dark, and Enki, in the darkness, sat with the finished tablet in front of him for a long time before he sent it to the archive. What he thought about in that long silence in the dark has not been recorded. Whether he doubted his choice at the last minute, whether he considered destroying the tablet before it could leave the room, whether he prayed to any authority above his own family for protection or vindication or forgiveness, we do not know. The scribe who preserved the account of the room and the lamp and the darkness added no commentary. The scribe simply recorded the physical circumstances and then noted that at daybreak Enki called for a messenger and sent the tablet, sealed, to the temple archive, with instructions that it be added to the sequence of the 11 that had come before, and that it be treated as the 12th and final statement, and that no further statement from him should be expected. The messenger carried the tablet. The archivist received the tablet. The tablet was placed in its numbered position, and then the family, having received word that the 12th statement had been submitted and could no longer be recalled, began the process that would end Enki's voice in the councils, and the process was completed within the following season, and the operation of the world continued as if nothing had changed, though everything, in a sense that the humans of the moment could not perceive, had. That is the end of the 12. That is the end of what Enki said. Everything after this, in the histories that survive, was written by others, in other hands, for other purposes. The voice you have been listening to tonight, the voice reconstructed from the fragments, is a voice that has not spoken in its own person for a very long time. It spoke tonight because you were willing to hear it. It will speak again, in this form, only when other listeners are willing to hear it again. Between hearings, it waits, in the fragments, in the museum collections, in the untranslated tablets, in the passages of scripture, whose provenance no scholar has fully traced, in the mystical traditions that preserve pieces without knowing what the pieces mean. It waits for the next reconstruction, and when the next reconstruction happens, it will say exactly what it said tonight, the same 12 statements, in the same order, with the same intent. Until the day, if that day comes, when the beings above finally read what was addressed to them, and the accountability that Enki set in motion in that dark room at Eridu finally arrives, and the operation that has run on this planet for a very long time is, at last, brought under review. Until then, the record is in your keeping. Do with it what you can. Enki did his part. The rest was always, and remains, up to you. There is one more layer to consider before this recording ends, and it concerns what has been happening to the 12 statements in the modern age, in the last 2 centuries, since the excavations at the Mesopotamian sites began to bring the physical tablets back into the light, because the excavations are the reason we can hear this sequence at all. And the story of how the excavations proceeded, who conducted them, what was found, what was preserved, what was suppressed, and what was mistranslated is itself a story that Enki, if he had lived to see it, would have recognized. The pattern of the modern handling of the tablets matches, in an uncanny way, the pattern of the ancient dispersal that the family originally imposed. Different actors, different centuries, different motivations, but the same net effect. Fragments come out of the ground. Fragments enter museum collections. Fragments get cataloged by scholars who do not, in most cases, know what they are looking at, or who know but do not have the institutional freedom to say what they know, or who say what they know but are ignored by the wider culture because what they know does not fit any framework the wider culture is prepared to entertain. The excavations began in the early part of the 19th century of the Common Era. British and French and later American teams worked at various sites along the Tigris and the Euphrates, at Nineveh, at Nimrud, at Kalhu, at Ur, at Uruk, at Nippur, at Eridu itself. The teams recovered enormous quantities of clay tablets, cylinder seals, and inscribed objects, and shipped most of the material back to museums in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in Philadelphia. The material was catalogued in the languages of the receiving institutions. according to systems the excavators found convenient rather than according to any system the original creators of the tablets would have recognized. Whole libraries were broken up and distributed across different museum collections in different countries, so that even today, a scholar wishing to compare fragments that were originally shelved next to each other in an ancient temple archive may have to travel to 3 or 4 different cities to see the fragments in person. The reassembly required to hear any sequence like Enki's 12 statements is, in this modern context, a logistical undertaking as much as an intellectual one, and only a small number of scholars have ever attempted it, and even fewer have completed it in a form that reaches the general public. The translations, when they were made by philologists who approached the material with certain assumptions. The philologists assumed the material was religious in a familiar sense, meaning that the tablets described the beliefs of an ancient people about gods those people had invented, rather than the testimony of beings the ancient people had actually encountered. Under this assumption, statements that would, if taken at face value, describe a literal encounter with a technologically advanced family from another star system were translated as poetic imagery, as symbolic language, as the mythological expression of a primitive worldview. The philologists were not, in most cases, being dishonest. They were applying the interpretive framework their training had given them. Their training had told them that ancient people believed in gods but had not actually encountered gods, and so any ancient text that described an encounter had to be, by definition, symbolic. The philologists translated accordingly, and the translations, once they entered circulation, shaped the way the general reading public understood what the tablets contained. The general reading public, seeing translations that described gods in symbolic terms, concluded that the tablets were symbolic documents about symbolic gods. The literal reading, the reading that would have been closer to what the ancient scribes actually intended, was available only to specialists who could read the original languages, and the specialists, being specialists, mostly stayed within the frameworks of their profession and did not challenge the general reading in ways that would have caused problems for their careers. There were exceptions. There have always been exceptions. A small number of scholars, from the earliest generations of Assyriology onward, have argued for readings closer to the literal, have proposed that the tablets are describing real beings and real events, have suggested that the family in the tablets is not a symbolic pantheon but an actual visiting group from elsewhere. These scholars have, without exception, been marginalized by their colleagues. Their work has been categorized as speculative, as sensational, as belonging to a fringe that respectable scholarship must dissociate itself from. Some of their work has been genuinely poor, and the marginalization in those cases has been deserved. But some of it has been careful, well-documented, and philologically defensible, and the marginalization in those cases has been imposed for reasons that had less to do with the quality of the work and more to do with the institutional pressure to maintain the mainstream framework. This is the modern equivalent of the ancient dispersal, not a coordinated effort. Not a conspiracy in the sense that meetings are held and plans are made. Just the ongoing operation of an institutional structure that finds certain readings unacceptable and quietly ensures that those readings do not receive the platform that would allow them to reshape the general understanding. The result is that the 12 statements, as a coherent sequence, have not entered the general awareness of the culture that emerged from the excavations. Individual pieces are known. The flood narrative is known, in the version that resembles the biblical version. The creation of humans from clay, mixed with divine material, is known, in scattered references. The wars between the gods are known, in outline. But the 12 as a sequence, in the order Enki intended, with the 12th statement as the concluding filing addressed to the beings above the family, has not been assembled in any mainstream publication and has not been taught in any mainstream educational setting. The assembly has been done, but the assemblers have been amateurs and independent scholars and, in some cases, members of traditions that preserved fragments of the sequence in oral form and passed those fragments down outside the reach of the mainstream academic institutions. These assemblers have, in their various ways, produced versions of the sequence that overlap with what you have just heard, though the versions differ in details and none of them commands the authority that a mainstream academic publication would command. This narration, tonight, is not a mainstream academic publication either. It is a reconstruction. It is a reconstruction made by considering the fragments that survive in their various collections, in their various translations, in their various contexts, and by arranging them in the order that Enki himself, in his own words within the surviving fragments, indicated was the intended order. The reconstruction is not certain in every detail. Some phrasings are more secure than others. Some passages are drawn from single fragments whose readings other scholars have contested. But the overall shape of the sequence, the 12 statements in their intended order, the movement from operational history in the first 6 to the concealment of that history in the last 6, and the climactic 12th statement about the beings above the family, is a shape that emerges consistently from the fragments, regardless of which contested readings are accepted or rejected. The shape is robust. The shape survives the scholarly disagreements. And the shape, in this narration, has been presented as clearly as the material allows. What you do with the shape, from this point forward, is a matter for you alone to decide. Enki, in the 12th statement, did not prescribe specific actions. He said only that the humans should preserve the record and develop their own capacities and prepare, in whatever ways seemed appropriate, for the return. Those instructions are still current. They are the same instructions the 12th statement gave in the day it was written, and they are the same instructions that any responsible transmission of the sequence should convey to any listener who takes it seriously. Preserve the record, not just this recording. The record, meaning the underlying fragments, meaning the physical tablets, meaning the museum collections, meaning the academic scholarship that has, whatever its limitations, kept the material accessible. Support the institutions that preserve these things. Do not allow, through neglect or through the pressures of shorter attention spans, the material to slip out of institutional care. It has survived thousands of years. It should survive the next generation as well, and the next after that, and however many generations are required for the accountability Enki hoped to trigger to actually be triggered. Develop your own capacities. This is harder to prescribe, because the specific capacities that will matter are not knowable in advance. Enki himself, in the 11th statement, said only that the humans should become the kind of species that a returning family would want to reintegrate rather than restore or abandon. What kind of species that is depends on the family, and the family will make its assessment according to criteria that no human can know in advance. But some criteria can be reasonably guessed. A species that has organized itself with some measure of coherence, that has preserved its knowledge base against the various forces that would erase it, that has treated its own members with something approaching dignity, that has demonstrated the capacity to think about questions larger than the immediate quarrels of its various factions, is a species that is more likely to be treated as a partner than as a labor pool or as a nuisance. Move toward those conditions, insofar as you can, in whatever role your own life places you in. That is not a moral prescription in the ordinary sense. It is a practical one. It is, in effect, what Enki was asking for when he said the humans could influence the outcome of the return by what they did in the interval. Prepare for the return. This is the hardest of the 3 instructions, because the return is not on a timetable that any human can consult. Enki refused to specify the timing in the 11th statement, and no other source that has survived provides a specific date. The return could happen in any of the coming generations. It could happen within the lifetime of persons currently alive. It could happen only after many generations more. The uncertainty is, itself, part of the situation, and any preparation has to be preparation that remains useful regardless of when the return actually arrives. That means preparation of a general kind, not stockpiling supplies, not building shelters, not making plans for specific dates, preparation of the mind, preparation of the culture, preparation of the record, preparation that ensures that whenever the return happens, the humans who are alive at that moment will have access to the 12 statements, will understand what they are, will be able to present them to any returning family members who inquire, and will have themselves already come to terms, in advance, with what the statements say. That kind of preparation is the kind that Enki, if he could speak now in his own voice again, would probably recommend. It is not dramatic. It is not urgent in the sense that a specific date creates urgency. It is patient. It is intergenerational. It is the kind of preparation that a species carries in its collective memory rather than in any individual person's plans. And it is, in the end, the only kind that has any real chance of surviving the intervals that separate the current generation from whichever future generation actually witnesses the return. Sit with the sequence. Sit with it tonight. Sit with it tomorrow. Come back to it periodically, when the events of your life, or the events of the world, remind you of one or another of the 12 statements. Notice how the statements, once you have heard them, become a framework through which subsequent experience can be interpreted. A political event that seems inexplicable begins to make sense when you ask whether the family fight described in the first statement might be operating in the background. A scientific discovery that seems too coincidental in its timing begins to make sense when you ask whether one of the seeded lineages described in the 10th statement might be involved. A cultural mood that seems to be shifting without any clear cause begins to make sense when you ask whether the seventh weapon described in the fifth statement is being considered and whether some early stage of its use might already be underway. The framework is not a substitute for ordinary analysis. It does not replace the normal methods by which humans make sense of their world, but it adds a layer to those methods, a layer that the mainstream frameworks systematically exclude, and the added layer often makes visible patterns that the excluding frameworks make invisible. That is the last thing this narration will say, before it ends. Enki gave the humans a framework. The framework was distributed across the 12 statements. The framework was designed to survive suppression by referring to itself so consistently that any part could point the reader toward the whole. The framework has, against very long odds, survived. It is available now, in this narration, and in whatever other reconstructions have been made or will be made in the future. And the framework, once absorbed, becomes a tool that the person who has absorbed it can use for the rest of their life, in every situation where the ordinary frameworks fail to explain what is happening. That is a gift. It is the gift Enki was trying to give when he set down the 12. It is the gift he paid for with his own voice. It has been passed down through the long, broken chain of the fragments to reach you tonight. And now, having received it, you become one more link in the chain that carries it forward to whatever future listeners will, in their turn, receive it from you. That is the end of the recording. That is the end of the 12. Go, now, and carry what you have heard. One last thought. The 12 statements are, in their final effect, a mirror. They describe what the family did, but in describing it, they show what any powerful being, when it is not being observed by any higher authority, will tend to do. The compartmentalization of knowledge, the management of a subject population through carefully controlled information, the reservation of the most consequential decisions to a small council whose members answer only to each other, the fabrication of origin stories that keep the subject population in a comfortable ignorance about the actual nature of the arrangement. All of these are patterns that appear in the family's behavior as Enki described it. And all of these, if the listener is honest, are patterns that appear in the behavior of many other organizations, at many other scales, throughout the human world, in the human present. The family is not the only actor that behaves this way. The family is only the largest and oldest example of a pattern that recurs, wherever power concentrates and oversight recedes. That recurrence is the most useful thing the 12 statements offer, not the specific claims about specific gods and specific weapons, which any listener can accept or not accept. The general pattern, the recognition that when a powerful actor is not being audited from above, the powerful actor will develop practices that would not survive an audit, will build concealment strategies to prevent the audit, and will punish any member of its own ranks who breaks the concealment. That pattern, once recognized in the 12 statements, becomes recognizable elsewhere. Enki paid for the recognition with his voice. The recognition, once given, does not need to be paid for again by those who inherit it. Use it when you need to. Do not use it as an excuse for paranoia or as a license to see conspiracies everywhere. Use it as a diagnostic tool, applied carefully, in cases where the ordinary tools have failed to explain what you are seeing. Enki has done his part. Record kept. You have heard it in full. What happens next is now left entirely in your own hands, and in the hands of every listener who follows.